Excellent. Okay, we are live. Hope folks in the room and online had a good lunch. The next thing we're going to talk about is artificial intelligence, something that I'm certainly really excited that we're going to be talking about, and that the co-chair and I have put in some time to try to set up a good discussion. Mr. Co-chairman, please.
Yeah, so, and the idea, Mr. Co-chairman, that we chatted about is really exploratory at this point in time, recognizing that I don't think other states have really passed any legislation related to AI, but it's a space where governance is certainly being discussed, and there's a lot of contemplation of what should and shouldn't be done with artificial intelligence. And this seems like the appropriate forum through our select committee to start taking a look at it, learning about it, and finding out if there is anything that perhaps we should take action on either in this legislative session or next legislative session as we move forward. There's certainly a lot that I think is on the horizon and the near horizon that we'll hear some more about today in our discussions and contemplate. So I ask the select committee, ask a lot of questions, explore this, learn as much as we can, and see what we should be doing, because we don't necessarily have any agenda in terms of what we want to accomplish other than to start learning in this space. So please explore away as we start hearing from some experts in this that we've put together for our discussion today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, Mr. Co-chair, and I wholeheartedly concur with everything you said. I think we've got some really interesting folks who are going to be testifying, who have a ton of exposure in the space from a regulatory perspective, from a technical perspective, from the policy and philosophical perspective that we'll be dealing with. So I think we've got a lot of really cool stuff to discuss this afternoon. You want to go in and just go into public testimony, or
I think we've got.
Okay, let's just go ahead and kind of hop into some of the folks that we've lined up. Daza, are you online? And
There he is.
Oh, there you are. Okay, tremendous.
Yes, thank you, Representative Western, Senator Rothfuss. It sounds like there may be a little bit of echo or feedback.
Is that on your end, or?
We're not hearing it.
We can hear you guys. We can hear you pretty well. So if.
I think it may be from a speaker in the room. Okay, it looks like Zoom is just adjusted. So thank you again very much for the opportunity to speak on this matter. And let me just double check with you how you would like to conduct this part of the hearing. Should we just jump right into presentations, or would you like to set more context, or what shall we do?
Daza, appreciate that. And we can hear you crystal clear. Maybe also, I think let's go ahead and just jump into some of the presentations. Chris, what are you thinking? Or Mr. Co-chair?
Yeah, Daza, when we chatted with you about just kind of putting together that introductory discussion and overview and bringing some material, I think letting you take the lead on that. And I know that you've got some other speakers that you've got to provide us that governance overview. So maybe start with some introductions and then go into the work that you've been exploring in the AI space.
And Daza, Ms. Co-chair, Daza, real quick, or tack onto that, maybe just give us a quick, 30-second intro. Obviously, Chris and I know who you are, but just we've got some new members here today. I think just a little bit of intro on each of you, I think would be helpful to give us some context. I think also, did we still have that demo? Was that still?
Yes,
I think so.
I think he's going to do that.
Okay, excellent. Yes, if you want to jump right in, go for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-chair. My name is Daza Greenwood. I run the the computational law research group at MIT at law.mit.edu, and also the legal tech consulting company civics.com. And I've got a background in technology law and a particular interest in artificial intelligence. And so I've in collaboration with the co-chairs, lined up a few presenters to help to provide some background and some context for the select committee as you begin to consider the potential implications of generative AI in a state law context. Joining me today are Dan Katz and Michael Bomarito, who, among other things, are basically famous in our area for working with OpenAI to put GPT-4 through the exam process of the bar exam. And they're deep experts in this area. They'll be able to talk more and lay a foundation about the nature of this technology and its impact on law and legal processes, and a lot more. I also have Damian Reel, who is basically he's a real thought leader when it comes to applying this technology to legal use cases. And he's going to show the committee what it looks like to be able to interact with large language models in terms of prompt engineering, prompt design, and also as part of an ongoing official process, a legal process. We also have Jesse Hahn, who is been working with us. As you were just asking about a demo, we've all worked together to create a demo that we hope can provide an anchor for how this technology is about to play out in the economy and in society, to help to provide some grounding, to think about the implications of the technology. And this also it follows up on my own work with your select committee in years past on algorithmically managed LLCs. That was in a DAO context. We're going to show how that plays out when the technology that is enabling the automation and autonomous processes for a Wyoming LLC is actually driven from an LLM, and that solves a lot of issues. It also opens new questions. And Jesse has taken the lead on engineering that and will demo it. And then finally, John Ney, who has been doing real thought leadership on fiduciary duties, and also on what it would look like to create a large language model from the ground up that is well aligned from a legal perspective. So I'm going to, each one of the people I just mentioned, of course, will introduce themselves individually and provide what I assume will be much better context for their remarks, but I just wanted to skip across the top of the waves to give you a sense of what's about to happen. So with that, I will make a couple of remarks myself just to set the table.
Please do.
Thank you. I believe that generative AI, this new breed of artificial intelligence that became known with the public wide adoption of ChatGPT at the end of last year, represents a profound advance in technology. And I think it's going to have a significant impact on the economy and on society, and that it's already beginning to do so in terms of how people do jobs, what jobs are needed, and also maybe more importantly, what it makes possible that was previously not possible. We'll see some of that with the demo on an algorithmically managed Wyoming LLC, but it really applies across the board. Nowhere more so than law itself, partly because law is really a language intensive profession and field. And so this technology has been a particularly good fit for doing many of the processes and tasks that lawyers frequently have done in the past and other legal professionals. But it doesn't end there. And so with that in mind, I think it's safe to predict that there are going to be a number of areas of state law that will be impacted by the changes that are now just starting to emerge. And this is good timing for the select committee and for the entire legislature in Wyoming to begin to understand and grapple with what the technology is, how it works, and to start to extrapolate or even to manage the changes that are already afoot within Wyoming and the ones that impact Wyoming from the broader economy. one thing that comes to mind in terms of just connecting the dots back to the work of this select committee in years past is this whole question of identity. And I think the select committee had a big win a couple of legislative sessions ago with creating a legal definition of personal digital identity and organizational digital identity. And that was needed and helpful for Web 2.0 and for the world as it existed then. And it also, so some of the members that had lived through that process will remember, it was very much also drafted with an eye toward the future. I think that future is now. And one of the implications of this technology is that the need is more urgent than ever to be able to identify the source of communications and to be able to attribute those communications to a human or to a legal entity. Even my publication at MIT, the MIT Computational Law Report, we're already getting submissions of materials that we never would have got before and that are clearly generated by this technology. That's a small example, but there are some publications that are being flooded completely. There are some lines of business that are going out of business now because of the flood of this new technology, some tutoring services. But more to the point, when you look at broad scale communications like public comment on the net neutrality regulations that went through a few years ago, there was the Attorney General of New York, I think just yesterday, issued a press release about a large fine to companies that had synthesized Americans' digital identities to create comments on their behalf that they were unaware of. They had no connection to. They were fraudulent, and there were large fines. That was done with some automation, but with a lot of manual processes. I think that's a harbinger of what's now possible for very low cost. At very, very low cost, it's possible to flood communications that seem to be from a human, but in fact are coming from this technology. That there's a lot of issues there, but I think fundamentally it's an identity issue. And the legal cornerstone you have that defines personal digital identity and organizational digital identity can be a cornerstone for building a legislative framework that begins to address the need to distinguish between communications that have sourced from a human that can be attributed and who can take responsibility and get the credit for those versus communications that are not sourced from a human. This is particularly important when we're conversing with another party. So one of the implications of these fake identities also comes up in a consumer protection context, where we're already seeing examples of synthesized convincing voices of people that you might know, maybe people in your extended family who are running scams where the voice is fake, but there's a scam being run that they've been arrested or that they're in some emergency and they just need you to wire money to them now. And you could go back and forth and talk to this person, and it may seem authentic, but in fact, it may be a fake. And so some of the advice from consumer protection groups now are to have a safe word with members of your family where they're supposed to use that word when they're communicating about an emergency. And if they don't use that word, it may mean that they're not safe. Maybe they're under some coercion, or in this new context, maybe it may mean it's not even them to start with. It may be a deep fake of them. Having families, and have everyone use information security and get educated and adapt to these changes is important, but we can't depend on people individually adapting to these profound changes. Eventually, there will be a need for some legislative framework that can adapt to and can support and reflect the new issues and options that arise from this technology. So I think identity is going to be one area to keep an eye on. Another one is when I think about areas that are customarily state jurisdiction, property is one of the first things that comes to my mind. In law school, we learn property law. It's fundamentally an area of state law. And I know that the select committee has already done tremendous good work with reforming laws as they relate to digital assets. I think there's about to be a lot more types of digital assets that people can create with this technology. It's possible to create code very quickly. I personally never been a particularly good developer. I'm now able to create lots of applications and services that I wasn't myself able to do before. I had to work with grad students or with colleagues at startups who were engineers to do them. I'm creating code now that I couldn't do before. Many people can create lots of works using this technology beyond code that are digital. And there raises a question about whose property is it, and how do you perfect rights to that property and be able to exchange rights to that property. There's I think a whole raft of things that come up with contracts and transactions in general, especially when we've got, so about generative AI in general, and we'll show you demos of it. Many people are familiar with it with a chat interface. The next wave of innovation, which we're going to delve into, is what we would call agent-based use of this technology. And so there is some, I think the most popular repository on GitHub today is something called AutoGPT. There's also something called Baby AGI. There are these software applications that are fueled by generative AI. And what they do is let you set a goal as a human, and then the AI will almost create its own prompts. It does sort of self-prompting about how would I break this goal up into tasks? How can I perform these tasks? And as these models are given access to the internet, maybe given a debit card or a prepaid card and other capabilities, they can actually go and perform a series of tasks that you may not know, but it's all in order to achieve a goal that you've set. So shopping bots are an example we've had for many years, when you can sort of configure settings to look for the best price on a certain type of good on eBay or somewhere like that, and go a long distance right up to executing a purchase. That gets blown open with this technology because it's general purpose language model. It can understand many different permutations of interactions and transactions. It can actually engage in some negotiation. It can do goal setting and keep track of benchmarks in order to achieve those. We'll show a lot more of that aspect of it as part of Jesse's demo on a algorithmically managed LLC, but it doesn't stop in the wrapper of an LLC. This is going to affect lots of contracts and transactions. And so I think automated transactions and electronic agents are going to be another area which state law has traditionally had a lot to say about, and where there'll be a need in the fullness of time to look at possible updates to legislative frameworks there. Education is another thing I just want to mention. I'm sure you're all thinking about it. In December and January and February, there was lots of articles of high schools and public colleges and other educational institutions wondering, how do we deal with essays that are being generated by AI and problem sets being done by AI and passed in by a student? What does this mean? And so there's much of this has to do with pedagogy and districts that will, operate, at completely different levels than the legislature, in terms of how to adapt to this technology in a way that still provides a solid education, and we're educating for the right things in the new economy. But there may well be a need at some point, especially for public education, to at some point set some legislative guidance on how to deal with this. It's changing the nature of how people do homework and education. It's also creating a new type of skill that people need to learn. Workforce training is the next emanation of that. So if you look downstream and we think about what kind of jobs do people need to do, and what's going to happen with the dislocation of some jobs that aren't needed and new jobs that are needed, and retraining and training people up for the right sorts of jobs, I think there's some kind of workforce development and economic development angle here, probably many. And then the final one I'll just mention, honestly, I feel like I could name every area of state law and draw a connection. I just want to name some of the highlights where there's a very clear nexus. The last one I'll mention is just with respect to regulatory reform and making statutes themselves. I've posted on civics.com/AI and law.mit.edu/AI transcripts of examples where I've used GPT-4 and another similar model called Claude by a company called Anthropic, that's a competitor with OpenAI, to help draft statutes where basically I come up with a novel fact pattern. I talk about what the needs are, and then iteratively I have the technology assist me in drafting statutes. I've drafted a lot of statutes in my time when I was in state government and working with Congress and in various places. And my sense was that it wasn't bad. It's not going to replace the Legislative Service Office anytime or anything like that, but it can be a boost in certain ways to fundamental lawmaking and to regulatory and to even regulation. And then there can be other ways in which it's a boost as well, in terms of monitoring compliance and setting benchmarks. So I won't go too deeply into that, but I think even the process of lawmaking may also have some impacts that are worth looking at, or can be beneficial. I'll close by saying it's not all sweetness and light, although I'm very optimistic and a big fan of this technology. I think it's going to do a lot of good. There are risks and potential harms to keep in mind as well, and that's also, I think, incumbent upon the legislature to be aware of. I think there's a underlying question of intellectual property. So the way these large language models are created, there's a huge training set, and that training set kind of vacuums a lot of information into the model. Some of that information has intellectual property rights by other people, and there's already some litigation we'll talk more about and go deeper in later with some of the other speakers. But I think there's a bit of a ticking time bomb there to keep an eye on. There's also a fundamental issue about the performance of the technology. Well, I'm saying it's helpful, and it is very helpful, and it does things we couldn't do before with computers. It's not perfect. It has some limits. It has flaws. It can provide incorrect information. And this is critical to look at and to make sure people understand. This may get back to education and to setting limits for not over relying on the output of this technology to our detriment. And there's some privacy issues that are related to intellectual property issues. When person identifiable information gets sucked into the training set, there's some concern that it may be capable of being regenerated with the right prompt, and that people could have privacy or personal data rights that are at issue. And then there's this whole raft of so-called high-risk use cases that the European Union is extremely concerned about, and that's when there may be a risk of a very expensive or very socially costly harm that could occur with this technology. I don't think we need to go too deeply into that today, but there are any number of kind of catastrophic scenarios that people have mostly hypothesized about today, but that are looking like some of those may be more practical now with the new advances of technology. Some of that may have to do with a takeoff scenario where a subsequent version of the technology gains something closer to artificial general intelligence, and being able to bound that. That's still a little bit futuristic. But for the moment, if you imagine maybe like a type of corporate espionage or something with a deep fake, like one of the candidates, for example, in Turkey, who dropped out just a few days ago, dropped out because of a extremely embarrassing video that was circulating around. He claimed for sure that wasn't me, that was a deep fake. That kind of claim is already happening in US litigation as well. You could imagine these things being weaponized by state actors or by well-resourced adversaries or people that just want to cause disruption for some reason. That could be what I would call a high-risk use case. There are also potential high-risk use cases for more mundane things, which is partly why when we show you this demo, this will be my last remark, we're not suggesting a completely autonomous legal entity. That could end up being potentially a higher risk scenario when others think that when maybe the entity's going off the rails a little bit and there's no human oversight. Legal entities can do lots of different things, and that could be extremely disruptive. You know, the importance of putting guardrails and safeguards and protections on the use of this technology must be part of allowing it to flourish and to support and reflect it with a pro-innovation legal framework, because it's not solely beneficial. There are potential risks and harms as well. But with that, I'd like to pause those initial remarks now, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or to clarify anything if the committee would like, or otherwise I would like to pass it forward to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Daz. Before we proceed, do we have any questions, committee members? Seeing none. Daz, I know part of our conversations is one thing I was particularly interested in was kind of the concept of the weights behind AI. What does that mean? How is it regulated? How is ownership attributed? A lot of these kind of stuff that you've touched on, and also, you know, I thought that the article you sent along about to the committee members just about autonomous agents and their potential impact. You know, given that we're elected officials, that article talked about what's their impact on campaigning, right, and organizing those kind of campaigns. It was very interesting, and I think, you know, it had this really real consequences. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation, because I think the question what we're trying to answer today is, you know, what regulation or legislation is needed in regards to AI? That's an incredibly huge and broad question, but I think it's one that it's incumbent upon us to try to at least tackle and see what does need to be addressed. Is now the time for legislation? Do we need to let things develop and then come back to the drawing board? You know, all that kind of stuff. So I really appreciate you and your colleagues, you know, Damian and Jesse and John and Dan, all these folks for setting aside time to help us. And it's, you know, you've heard the joke about the sausage making process and legislation and all that stuff, but you guys are playing that part right now in that process and trying to start broad and refine it down to a finished product. So really do appreciate it. I think you covered a lot of the stuff that we had talked about, and I know that, you know, our committee members will weigh in on. I don't have any specific questions at this point. Mr. Co-Chair, do you have any questions or things you want to weigh in on?
Mr. Chairman, I'll hold off because I know we have a few presentations, and I think as we get into more details, the questions will certainly arise. So I've got plenty, but I'll pause for now.
Absolutely. And, you know, Daz, and for all you folks online, would it be easier for us to hold our questions off till the end? If members have a question in the moment, is it okay for them to hop in and ask, or what's better for you?
Thank you for asking. So the way we had prepped is with the thought that we would stick on the line and answer questions after each person's presentation as needed. And then everybody is also extremely behind the idea that you've been elected and that we're testifying to your committee. And so we obviously will stop talking at any moment if you have a question or a clarification or anything that you want to say.
Sure, absolutely. And I think it's fine with us maybe holding our questions off until each presenter is done. Then we can kind of delve into questions. I'm certainly fine with that. And just real quick for Dan and Damian, some of the other folks online, and John, just the standard format is when they do get into that Q&A, everything goes through the chair, just as kind of a legislative protocol to keep the dialogue smooth. So just a little bit of a house cleaning I wanted to make you aware of, but please proceed.
Thank you. And through the chair, I would like to say to the committee, in response to the two items that you did bring up, Representative Western, number one, about weights, and two, sort of about looking forward. My opinion is that there are a few things that are essential with respect to understanding and being able to know how to predict and rely upon the outputs of these models, and that requires some transparency on the model. In my belief, some of that has to do with what is the training set that went into the model. Okay, What is the data that it was trained on? Another thing has to do with what are the weights and how many parameters there are. Jesse and others can go into more, and Dan and almost everyone else on this call can go into more detail into what that means technically. But in order to a material aspect of these language models is the weights that are allocated to different parts of the model. And if you change those weights slightly, you will get very different outputs from the model using the same training set. So how those weights are allocated is a big part of what it means to configure and create a given model. Open source large language models share what the weights are, because that's how another person could take the code and could train the model and get something like the same results. And so in my opinion, there's a question about the intellectual property and things like that. Some companies with proprietary models do not share their weights. I think in our country and with our economy, there's got to be I think that's not inappropriate entirely. What I do think is important is that there always be several robust, available, competitive open source models where the weights and everything else are also available. European Union and others there's more regulatory approaches to what I just said. Some would almost like nationalize, it sounds to me, some of these models and require more transparency and more sharing of their secret sauce and the proprietary information. I don't know. I think that's a political question, and I don't know that if that's the right fit for the United States. I do think it makes a lot of sense for there to be at least some open source models. And I'll close by saying we would in terms of like what is ready for legislation now. To me, it seems like it's time for education, and it may be premature to know what legislation exactly would be appropriate. Also, these technologies changing fast. There are things in the pipeline, like just today, OpenAI released plugins to everybody that has a premium account, which is like a $20 a month account that gives you GPT-4 access. These plugins extend the use of the technology to integrate it with, like web browsing and with Zapier and with Expedia and all this stuff. It's sort of the beginning of the agents thing we were talking about, but I call it the integration revolution. That's going to significantly expand the way people use the technology and the types of interactions and transactions and outcomes that are possible. So my sense is it may be premature to have very prescriptive legislation at this point while the target is still evolving so quickly, but it's not too soon to get educated. And in collaboration, and we hope support of the education. An of the things that we're going to say at the end, and I'll come back to after the last speaker, is once we show you the demo of what an algorithmically managed Wyoming LLC could look like, that's powered by these large language models, by generative AI, we're going to suggest a kind of a challenge where we make our code available. Jesse makes his code available, and we let people use this according to different things that the committee and others may be interested to test. So we'll have to see what the conversation from this hearing is, but there'll be open questions. We can frame those as a kind of challenge and let people try to create their own examples of algorithmically managed LLCs, submit them back. I think MIT's raised our hand and said we're willing to be an umbrella partner for that, and then make those all available back to the select committee before your next hearing in September to begin to get a little bit more traction and understanding of how this technology could play out in an example, and maybe have a better informed basis to consider what legislation may be appropriate and needed at that point. So those are just some thoughts about where everything is like in the life cycle of legislation. It's still pretty early days. It's just a few months since this technology has become widely available. And I think a few more months at least would be appropriate to make any calls about what the scope of definite legislation might be with respect to it. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Daz. I think that's super awesome. And I really appreciate your guys' willingness to put in this work and make it just available and to pull us in. I will warn you, when you put me in front of stuff, I kind of feel like in the Neanderthal with a spear getting in the cockpit of an F-22. You know, it's a little intimidating, but I really appreciate your willingness to kind of pull us in and walk us through this stuff. And for the other folks online, I'll just really speak for myself. Please do pause and, you know, really kind of walk us through exactly what we're seeing. Cause I think certainly for some of us and for myself, I might not know exactly what I'm seeing in some of the stuff that you're talking about in some of your presentations. So do not feel free, or please do feel free to really kind of, you know, walk us through what we're looking at and what exactly it is that we're looking at. So thank you. Please do proceed. Or Mr. Chairman or co-chairman, do you have any? We're good. Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you very much for your willingness to collaborate with us in that way. We'd be happy to walk you through. When you see Jesse's demo, you'll see that it's been designed it's really designed for small business and for a person that has an LLC, maybe for their ranch or something where, you know, it's not for a big company, but we're trying to see what would be useful with this technology that could simplify and streamline the process of using legal entities for everybody. And so the idea that anybody could sit in this cockpit and fly is one of the goals we're going for. So, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Next up is what I would call the premium education. I hope I serve the purpose to at least set the table, but now we have a real heavyweight champion with Dan Katz and Michael Bomarito, who are at the forefront of educating people and lawyers and professionals about this technology, and who have kindly agreed to share their sort of a tip of the spear slide deck with the committee. So I would like to hand it off to Dan Katz. And again, the reminder is please introduce yourself and your affiliations before addressing the committee.
Very good, and thank you very much. I just can somebody enable the screen sharing? I don't know who has authority over that.
Mr. Katz will work with Ella. So can we?
Oh, it looks like it's up and it's already now it's working. Thank you.
We're good. Go ahead, please.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank the committee for having us here today. Wanted to provide some overview comments that kind of get us moving down. I think we'll get into greater and greater detail, perhaps just sort of looking at the agenda as the day progress, or as the session progresses. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dan Katz. I'm a professor at the Chicago-Kent College of Law, which is the law school of Illinois Institute of Technology. I'm wearing the vest today, and I'm also affiliated faculty at Codex, which is the sort of law and computer science interacted at Stanford. And I'm also an entrepreneur. I run this company with my colleague, Mike Bomarito, who I'll introduce in just a second, called 273 Ventures. We're building what's called a legal data operating system. I won't belabor that. I just on background. So my colleague, Mike Bomarito, I don't know, Mike, if you just want to say, if you want to introduce yourself, I got a couple slides here.
Sure. So similar to Dan, except I'm not affiliated with IIT as faculty, also at Stanford, and I'll let you get back to the deck here. But thank you for having us, just to express that.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll just sort of start chronologically. I think this date here, November 30th, 2022, will go down as one of the more important days in the history of technology, because this is the day that ChatGPT was first released to the public. And I think that was sort of the beginning of the broader public's awareness of kind of what was already true, which is in the background. What's been happening is there have been really significant increases happening in this field of natural language processing. And that's really the way in which computers come to understand language. And language has been historically a very hard problem for computers to deal with. And we've been seeing sort of progressive increases in those capabilities. But I think what's really important is that when this chat interface, and I'll go more into detail of this, was made available, that made it very easy for people to kind of type in Google-like searches and get kind of output. They really got a flavor for, the public got a real flavor for kind of what was happening. And it's been reported that, ChatGPT went from to 100 million users in something like 100 days. I don't know if that is like a more, I think there's at least a couple of sites that support that idea. But either way, there's been a substantial number of people who've gone and actually kind of used these systems and experienced them for themselves. Mike and I have personally been working in this area for a little while, thinking about kind of how these language models could be used in the legal domain. I just highlight a couple of projects or a couple of things we've been working on, just kind of emblematically. Mike and I had a company which we sold 5 years ago, which was doing what might be called classical language modeling, and not using these neural networks, which is what powers something like ChatGPT or GPT-4 or any of these other large language models. But just to kind of say, we've been experimenting both in the commercial world and then kind of in the academic world. I'll just sort of flip through a few of these. I'm happy to provide these slides to the committee if that would be of use. So I'm just kind of give it more of a on background or as an overview. Last year, we gave a presentation.
Yeah, that would be real quick. That would be excellent after all this, if you could email it to us so we can.
My pleasure. Sure. Absolutely. No problem. Last year, we did a presentation where we talked about this idea of breaking the legal language barrier. And the concept was, what we've seen historically is machines are getting better at regular language, kind of like that the public uses, but legal language is a whole nother animal. It's a much harder thing. I mean, I'm a law professor, and we spend a lot of time training students to understand, what public might call legalese, and it can be somewhat impenetrable. And could machines do a task, have any success on a task like working with legalese or legal jargon? And it seemed like we were on the doorstep substantial acceleration, but just you started to see the inklings or the tea leaves that something like that might be possible. And I'll just flip to this, but one of the things in the legal sector or in the for legislators or judges or other folks, managing partners of law firms and so forth, or court general counsels of companies, it's been hard to communicate to folks in the legal sector about kind of how significant of a landscape shift has been happening in these language models. And so I think part of it is that in the media, there have been a lot of these kind of robot lawyers like stories in the media. So this is just like a sample of what's been out there over the last, 5 or 10 years. And, I've never met a robot lawyer. There must be one. They keep talking about it all the time. But nevertheless, there's been all this, all these stories written, and it is about people trying to work on using AI to do some of the tasks that lawyers have done historically, or to give them, to augment them, to give them kind of like tools to do tasks a lot faster or more effectively. But the challenge in even kind of until very recently is that language, which is very important, probably the core of the field of law, is language, has been really hard for machines to work on. And so, things have been done more on the periphery, but on the core, it's been very difficult. So I think one of the things that's been a challenge is really the absence of a clear demonstration project. And I'll talk more about one of those demonstration projects in just a moment. But just kind of to set the stage, because this is some of what I was asked to do, is just kind of set kind of the overview to get us going. AI has made progress on many topics. And so the field of artificial intelligence actually encompasses many other sort of branches here that are shown, and some of which are kind of relevant perhaps to today's discussions, and some which might be less relevant, but just broadly are interesting. For example, something like a driverless car involves, machine vision, can involve processing language. But, for language models as done today, it's kind of the natural language processing branch combined with deep learning above. But the point of showing this graphic is just to highlight, when you hear AI, there's actually a whole bunch of sub things going on underneath, and not every one of AI application is precisely the same. I think it's worth understanding and noting that. And I think obviously when you think about regulation or regulatory categories, it's important to understand these nuances are important. One of the things I will say is that language has historically lagged pretty much every other advance in AI, because language is hard, and part of what makes it hard is that there's these what we call statistical dependencies in language. But I'll kind of compare in a moment, like syntax versus semantics. I mean, machines are really good at counting up the number of words in like on a page, or even the frequency of words, but the understanding of what those words mean in context has been historically a much harder problem. We finally see in the commercial space and in the academic space really significant advances coming to market. So just kind of again on background, these language models historically were based on rules. So if you remember back in the 80s, your like spell checkers were not exactly fabulous, to put it lightly. They were pretty poor, and it was basically roughly based on the idea of like like good old Clippy there was there trying to use rules to figure out spelling. But the best way to figure out spelling is have a billion instances of spelling in a Google searches, and then sort of test, hey, is this the right one or is that the right one? Do they click on the left or the right? And then that feedback effect sort of, you get to sort of ultimately a much better spell checker. So that was all you could do at one point with machines. You could do these rules-based approaches because, and I'll just show you these two big dynamics, some of which you might be familiar with, but just, to put everybody on equal footing. So the speed of a computer processor, Gordon Moore, the person, he was one of the founders of Intel, but he just passed away in the last couple like month or two. But this Moore's law is not a strict law, but it's a kind of an observation that the speed of a computer processor has been doubling roughly every 18 to 36 months for 50, 60 years, something like this. And that's exponential growth. And so you're doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling. And that's one of the big accelerators here. The other kind of less discussed accelerator is this thing called Kreider's law, which is the cost of storing data has gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So, if you go to like a conference or something and they give you a thumb drive, maybe it's 5-10 gigs, like a 10 gigs, that'd be $3 million worth of data storage in 1981. And now they're like, just give it away for free. Like here's a squishy ball and a pen and you can take a couple drives with you. And so it's, that just organizations are hoarding data essentially because data is so cheap to store. Eventually, these chips got faster and data storage got cheap so that you could use statistics in the modeling of language. And so in the 90s and 2000s, you started to see statistical models in the field of NLP, language modeling. What people did historically is they focused on syntax, and you actually can make a lot of progress with syntax. Semantics is a much harder thing. Historically, there's this division between a syntax model, I'll give you examples of both in a second, and semantics has been kind of the holy grail for this space, a really hard problem. So syntax, you're probably familiar with it minimally at least. Like if you went to, these are the types of things like looking at words, what words are on a thing, how frequent they are, how frequent certain parts of speech are. And the most well-known example of a syntax approach with a computer is if you went to your computer and you hit Control F, that's find the exact instance of a word in a document. And machines are amazing at this, and they're way better than people at this. If I gave you a 100-page document and say, find the number of times this particular word shows up, the machine's going to get it pretty much perfect every time, and people will not. And so that's an example of something where machines are already materially better. Now, we don't think of that as being a huge deal, but that is actually looking for syntax. You can go up a level in terms of sophistication and say, I'm not looking for this exact word. You can write something that's called a regular expression. It's a little tiny bit of computer code that's looking for a pattern in a given set of information. So here, I don't want exactly 17 USC section 107. I want, a number, USC, a section symbol, and then another number up to 4 characters long. And so it can look for all these different patterns that sort of meet this standard of a pattern. So I could use something like this to find every reference to the United States Code in a document, whether it's a pleading or some other document. You can do fancier stuff where you play around with the number. This is more of a technical thing we don't need to belabor, but just you can do fancier and fancier things with syntax, but you're not really getting into the depth of what stuff really means. Now, again, I wear this like two hats in life because like in the training of lawyers, just part of what I do as a law professor is, we spend a lot of time teaching people, what did the court mean when they used this phrase in this exact way? What did the legislature mean when they drafted this bill and they deleted this provision and that provision, and they did it with a lot of care? Why did they choose that? That's semantics. What does this word mean in a given context? What does this regulation mean? Semantics is about both what words mean, and of course, meaning isn't just word by itself, it's in the context of other surrounding words, and those words interact to kind of create higher order meaning. So it's not just a word by itself, but its context. And that's been really hard for machines to decipher. By the way, it's hard for people to decipher. If I handed them a bill that's pending before the legislature, or a judicial decision or something like this, or any really complex document, it really takes a lot of work to process it. Now, I have to be okay at doing legal documents. If you gave me a medical document, I would struggle with it. And a doctor would do a very good job with that, probably. So the point is that, a lot of the training we do, if you think about the labor market, and the labor market for lawyers or whatever, is this semantic training of people to be language processors, parsing documents, understanding what they mean in particular contexts. Semantics historically has been very, very hard for machines. In the last decade, we began to see progress on this front, where what I would call it is kind of quasi-semantic methods. Now that's a kind of that sounds like some law professor talk right there, but basically, I don't want to say that machines like understand in the strict, strong sense, but they're able to kind of infer what something means in context. I'll say, like they understand in air quotes, but just to kind of highlight the idea that maybe it's not full understanding, but it's good enough to do some task. And the idea of that is that the methods can take context into account, broader and broader sets of context into account. And what we see people today using is these neural networks to work on language problems. So it's actually back to the graphic, the combination of these two things put together. So won't push this whole, but like a lot of the same things people want to do with computers are the same, but the process in the meantime, from an engineering perspective, is very different when you're using the one at the bottom, which is the more modern approach, as opposed to the one at the top. So we see these progress, by the way, in contexts like in language and legal NLP as well. Mike and I, with several other colleagues, have done a survey of kind of every natural language processing paper written where somebody was working in the legal domain, including some of the examples, by the way, involve bills in legislatures, both in the United States and globally, where people say, could we use computers to kind of like help in that process in some way or another? I'll just highlight this part right here. Is what we're seeing in this space is kind of a mirror of what you see in the whole space, which is that, the neural agenda has come finally to the legal world. We're starting to see neural methods being used to do legal NLP type problems. I'll skip over that. Okay, now let's get to GPT. Now, I would say, like the marketing department here might have spent a little more time coming up with the name. I mean, it just rolls off your tongue, generative pre-trained transformer, let's try to unpack this a little bit if we can. It's what they call a large language model. It's far from the only one. I think that's one of the things I want to make sure that you take away today, is that there's, Daz's opening comments highlighted this as well. For timing purposes, I'm largely going to focus on the GPT models by OpenAI, but I just want to make the point that broadly, like, for example, this is a recent paper that just tried to catalog all of the models that are out there and try to put them in different families kind of by approach. And by the way, this paper is maybe 2 months old, and it probably would have, I don't know, substantially more boxes on the board than just we had even 2 months ago. So I'd send you over here to take a look at it, but it just gives you a flavor for the sheer amount of innovation that's taking place right now. It's really quite incredible. And and the United States is by far the leader on all of this, and very much hope it stays that way. So the OpenAI models from GPT combine several ideas from the papers in the following progression. So this is kind of the paper, in my view, that kind of kicks us off in this kind of semantic, heading down the path to semantics. If you went back 10 years, there's this paper, the Word2Vec paper, as people would often call it, but it's, and I won't get it, it's not useful, I think, to get into technical details, but I want you to see what's happening now as more of a broader progression of things that have been taking place, first in the laboratory kind of environment, and now pretty heavily in the commercial world as well. But one thing to note is that Google, for example, has been responsible for many of the innovations that we've seen. And people ask, well, is OpenAI going to get passed by Google? Well, certainly I don't know for sure, but I would say they got a puncher's chance because they've been involved in developing a lot of the underlying technology here. And, it's a competitive landscape here. It's not a single company story here. It's a many company story. Now, there's several of these papers in progression that kind of lead you to first this paper on the attention mechanism. And this is probably the most important paper in terms of setting things up, is this paper called Attention is All You Need. And I'll say more about this in a moment, but I just want to kind of slide through several of these, and I'm going to come back to this paper, Attention is All You Need, in a second. But again, you see that Google AI is involved in this paper, and this is where the transformer architecture is really proposed and demonstrated in a particular model where I'll talk about it in just a second. But just to show you, there's many of these models and papers that have come down the pipe, and I try to summarize. And again, I'm happy to send along the slides for the committee's consideration. Again, you see Google AI, BERT, and then the GPT trilogy. Now we're on GPT-4, but the 3 models that lead up. So GPT-1, 2018, GPT-2, 2019, GPT-3, 2020. Then more papers, more models. For example, this is a leading, an important one, Big Bird. And then this is what gets you ChatGPT. Is they take a mod, they said, well, if you're going to create a chat interface, machines got to be able to understand, again, using air quotes, the instructions that people might give it. So if I give it an instruction, it has to understand, what are you asking me to do? And so they built a separate module. I'll show you how they connect all this in a second, but they built a separate module that's very focused on instructions and training a model to understand instructions and figure out, essentially, if you think about this phrase, the call of the question, or the ask. What are you being asked to do exactly? And then the most recent offering, GPT-4, released approximately 2 months ago. Okay. Now, it should be noted that these the OpenAI models are proprietary models, and we do not know all the deep details of what has exactly been done here. So the information I'm providing is my best understanding, or Mike Bommarino and I's best understanding of what's happening here. But I just want to have said that is not 100% out there. Again, I take Daz's point earlier, which is, if they were to tell everybody what they were doing, then they're going to lose a lot of the competitive advantage they have. And so they have a certain interest that I completely understand of not like, look, if I tell everyone, Amazon and Google and Baidu and all these folks are going to copy it. So they don't want to put it all out there. So that they're not 100% open, but they're more open than than you might imagine, given how important what they've developed is. So we're not going to get into all the super deep technical details. If you really want to geek out a little bit, I like this blog post that's just been turned into a book by the sort of legendary physicist Stephen Wolfram. Kind of went through ChatGPT and tries to describe it in a much more mathematical and technical detail. So I'll send you over there. I'll skip that slide, but I want to make sure you kind of know the 3 big moving parts here. Better hardware, parallel computing, and the attention mechanism. That's what's put us on this path over the last few years. It's kind of a brew, or the first thing I would say is, if you have any members of your family or your friends or whatever that play video games or are gamers, the graphics cards that power these incredible games from just a pure graphic perspective and the immersive nature of these video games back when Mike Bommarino and I were in graduate school, and this is, go back 15 years, people were starting to realize, if you can compute those incredible immersive graphics, that you could actually use it to do other computing problems in the sciences. And so it's actually kind of these graphics cards that come from another, that a lot of the focus and attention had been to make really cool video games are actually useful for a range of other scientific applications. So keep that. That's kind of one item in the brew. Now, the hardware race is part of this too. So this is an important announcement from Google that they have a chip that's faster than the leading NVIDIA chip, NVIDIA being a Taiwanese manufacturer, and obviously Google US. So just to give you a view, though, of kind of why this Attention is All You Need paper is so important, is if you had a single graphics card, a single GPU, and you were to try to train just an older model, GPT-3, it'd take like roughly 300 years to train that model. Now, one of the first things folks learn in computer science is parallelization. So you take a really large task and you chunk it into smaller tasks and you run it on multiple computer processors, and then you connect the task back together. So being able to parallelize something is really, really important. And historically, it's been very hard to parallelize these types of tasks, these language tasks. And so this paper, Attention is All You Need, sort of shows people the prospect of parallelization in this context. And so what they show in the paper, and it was a really big deal when it came out, at least in the technical world, is they trained a 1 billion word model on just a handful of these graphics cards in 3.5 days. And that was like, and again, I showed you the previous thing is 300 years. So just that was a harbinger of what was to come, but that was a really sort of put people on the path. And now it's being done on a mega scale with something like a GPT-4 or an Anthropic or what have you. Is the scale at which people are doing this is thousands of these cheap graphics cards are necessary, parallelizing, these very large sets of documents. So just for terminology sake, GPT-3 was released again in 2020. The most recent model until the last 2 months was GPT 3.5. The family of models includes ChatGPT, and there's probably going to be a family of models in GPT-4. So now the inputs. We don't know exactly 100% what's inside, but this is at least what has been described. Mike, I know you wanted to maybe just say a word or two about this part.
No, I think maybe connecting this to the copyright issue or the question about whether copyright applies would be a good point here. So Daza, you had mentioned and responded to one of the initial questions that alluded back to a prior conversation around property rights. And I would say on this slide that one of the issues that is most germane to who owns both the model itself in whatever sense that may mean, as well as the outputs, is this question of what the inputs are. And so the question of provenance of inputs, that is knowing internally, that is documenting what you put into it, and then to what extent transparency is required either to counterparties in private sense or public counterparties, i.e., or for example, like a licensor, as the EU is experimenting with in its proposed EU AI Act, is key. So if the creators of these models are not tracking what exactly is put in, then it's a problem. Many of these largest organizations are, of course, because the quality or cleanliness of the data that they put in is one of the ways in which they control the quality of the model as it's created. But then we also have this question of, to what extent should we require, either in private contracts or from a public perspective, a disclosure of what has gone into the model, and how, for example, if the state were to create a property registry for these models, would disclosure of training data maybe play into that, right? So I think, senators, we previously discussed briefly at least a property register, for example, for weights as a way of distinguishing the state, or of being able to provide some assurances for holders of IP related to these models, that this type of thing is treated or classified, at least in the state, as, let's say, tangible personal property or some other kind of property for which there's a registry that shows clear ownership and could be pointed at or used in other kinds of transactional documents. And I think the inputs is probably key to part of that property registry conversation, because we don't know what's gone into this, then it's difficult to really start that provenance chain and to have clear ownership in, for example, the sense we have with real property. So let me stop there. Dan, we can come back to that later, probably a better use of time.
It's clear that they've done some pre-processing or cleaning up of the underlying internet because obviously if you've seen the internet, presumably it's not necessarily always the nicest place. And so if you just took it as is, no cleaning it up, it would be, it wouldn't perform in quite the way that, has been shown so far. But just to kind of give you a view of what they've done, if you went back to GPT-3 from 2020, you take the original GPT-3, you connect, as I mentioned earlier, that Instruct GPT, the instructions module. Then you have engineers further tune, supervised tuning on instructions. And then there's a thing called reinforcement learning, and that's humans taking the output and kind of going thumbs up, thumbs down on the output, and using the feedback effect of that to calibrate or to refine the model. That's sort of the cocktail that gets you ChatGPT. And then GPT-4 is a continuation on that. Now, the technical report for GPT-4 does omit, frankly, the key details one would need to know to reverse engineer it. Now, again, I mentioned, if you were running the company, you might consider that that's not the greatest idea to take your IP and put it on display to everyone, or at least, folks might question that decision who work there. One of the things that's interesting, there is a table that sort of highlights that the value of reinforcement learning seems to be declining. Doesn't seem to really move the needle as much as it probably did in earlier versions of the model. The reason I highlight all these moving parts is just to flag for you, which I think is one of the important takeaways, at least as I see it, is that there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things happening here, and other players in this space are going to make different choices, and you're going to have, in my view, in the next 6 to 12 months, a whole federated set of models, including models for specific domains and just a range of models, and it's going to be a very competitive landscape, and an entrepreneurial battle between startup companies, big companies, and kind of everything in between. So now I'd like to kind of, with that background, talk a little bit about its capabilities applied to the law. So I'm going to discuss some public work we have done, Mike and I have done. As I mentioned, there had not really been a clear demonstration project in the domain of law, really showing the kind of nature of these capabilities. So right before the holidays, Mike and I, I worked with Mike, my frequent collaborator, Mike Bomarito, and we applied the older model, GPT 3.5, to the multiple choice portion of the bar exam, the MBE, and then put the paper online. GPT takes the bar exam, and around that same time, there was another paper where people were focusing on the medical licensing exam, the USMLE, I think it's called. And just kind of, we wanted to sort of see, well, how good could it do? And it got roughly 50% of the questions right, which the guess rate is 25%. So that represented a kind of, a pretty important improvement from pure guessing. Not enough to pass, but it was starting to get close to much closer to the passage threshold. That paper kind of put us on a path to be part of the launch of GPT-4 about 2 months ago. You may have seen this result that is in the table from OpenAI. That is part of that, and then it kind of went all over the place, including like on Stephen Colbert, they did like this kind of like personal injury law firm, but as these bots that were personal injury law firms. Pretty funny actually, so this is the paper. It's online for people to take a look at in draft form. GPT-4 passes the bar exam, and I'll say just a little bit about it, but it wasn't just now the multiple choice. We also did the essays and the performance test as well. So if you're not familiar, just for everyone's purposes though, the uniform bar exam kind of has 3 parts. It has the multiple choice part, which is half the test, 200 points, the essays, and the MPT, which is the performance test. I'll go through each of these in a little bit, but we won't drill the center of the earth, but just to kind of give you a flavor for things. So on the multi-state bar exam, the MBE, there's these 7 topics are tested. These are kind of the classic first year of law school type topics that folks would be very familiar with who attended law school. So there's 200 of these questions from different drawn equal weights across those 7 topics. There's 25 experimental questions, but this is like an example question. All of this is in that paper, so we can send you that paper as well. So I'll just kind of give you the highlights. But there's a prompt, and then there's four possible answers, and you pick from the list. This is the progression. We didn't just do in the GPT-4 paper, even the prior paper, we didn't just do the new model. We wanted to kind of look historically, like what's the progression look like here? So if you went back to GPT-2, which is about 4 years old, it can't really effectively process the questions. So if it tried to take the bar exam, it basically gets 0% right, because it can't really even handle the size of the question, because you see all that text, the context that you would need to take in. These are what they call intermediate models. So between 2 and 3. 3 is also known as Da Vinci 1. Yeah, I didn't come up with this scheme. It's a little hard to keep straight, but Ada, Babbage, and Curry are older models, and they're able to process the questions, but they're not able to beat the random guessing line. Like if you just guess C on average, you'd get 25% on the test. So what we see in Da Vinci 1, also known as GPT 3.0, it's able to beat random guessing, but not by like a ton, about 10%, about 35% of the questions right. And then the ChatGPT, GPT 3.5 gets about half the questions right. And then the most recent release, GPT-4, which is the one we evaluated in the paper that I showed you, it's able to get over 75% of the questions correct. That's better than the average student and well above the passing threshold. It does differentially well on different topics within there, which would be expected. I mean, some of these topics are like intrinsically harder than others, and it almost certainly also has to do with the input data that we were just talking about. Like how much information does it have about each of these topics? That almost certainly is a factor in its performance. And we didn't really evaluate that fully. We just kind of reported the scores, but that's certainly an open question. Why does it do better in some areas than others? Now, switching to the essays. In the multi-state essay exam, there's 12 topics, and for any given administration, they pick 6 of these in a sitting of the bar exam. Now, we evaluated the July 2022 bar exam, which at the time we were doing the evaluation was the latest available version. They since have taken the February 2023 exam, but that wasn't when we were evaluating it. Was before that they'd even had the test for February. What we gave it is this prompt. You'll hear more about prompt engineering today, but we gave it this prompt here, which is basically, just a few sentences to kind of set things up, and we combined it with the actual question that is in the real test. So I'll show that to you in 1 second. And then to grade it, we used these representative good answers, which are answers that are actually produced by various bar association, various state bars, and they're real answers by people who took the test, and they call them not just average passing answers, although they're not perfect answers. So, but towards the upper end, obviously, of the continuum. So here's a given question from July 2022. I won't go all the way into it, but it's an evidence question, and you can see there's a pretty long prompt to get like vignette that you have to go through, and then you're given these 3 sub questions. And what we do is the only modification we make from just giving this straight up is we just give it 1 sub question at a time and connect it to the prompt I just showed you. And so just to give you a backwards feel for things, if you went back to GPT-3 from 2022, you'd see that, that's not going to pass the bar exam. That's not even close. It's both substantively wrong, and it's just not enough. I mean, it's like 4 sentences here. And so that's kind of was the nature of the capabilities in 2020. And if you had sat there in 2020, you'd say, this system is never going to pass the bar exam, or never anytime soon, because that doesn't look like it's on any path to anything. And so this is kind of the nature of the acceleration that's gone on. Now, this is where it gets challenging. I have ChatGPT on the one side, and we have GPT-4 on the other. On its face, this ChatGPT answer looks pretty good. The other one you could kind of easily reject as being like not even close. This is a lot harder. Now, let me just explain. If you got into the details, what you'd see is, what you should say in this question is that Rule 702 governs the question, and there are 4 parts of 702 you have to satisfy to get an expert witness on the stand. It actually only cites 3 of those 4 parts. Then if you see the second to last paragraph, it describes Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. Now, Rule 403 is not a completely nothing to do with this sort of problem. It's what I'd say is outside the scope of the question that's been asked. So this is kind of like what a student of mine would do if they didn't know the answer. They'd sort of write something close and hope that it landed. And that's kind of some of what you sort of see going on here. Now, there'll be discussion later probably about model hallucinations. Now, that word has been used to pick out several different things. This isn't really a hallucination as people would often have meant it. Hallucination means it makes up a rule that doesn't exist. That is a real rule of evidence, and it's actually kind of related to the question. It's just out of scope from the question as specifically asked. But again, not a pattern you could never see in real. I've graded a lot of essay exams over the years as a law professor. This type of thing shows up a lot. This kind of pattern replicates itself throughout the difference between ChatGPT and GPT-4. Now I'll switch over to the MPT. All the output is online on GitHub, on Mike Pomerito's GitHub for you to take a look at if you're interested. But the MPT was added to the bar exam because they wanted to have, the view was that we need a more realistic set of lawyering tasks. And so here you're asked to do a realistic lawyering task, 2 of them. You have to do 2 separate ones. I'll just talk you through this one here. Here you're asked to draft a memo to a partner about a particular matter. And they give you 2 things. They give you a packet of materials. It's a case file. The case file has has a deposition transcript and some investigator notes. And so it's supposed to, again, simulate the idea of a real case file. And then it has what they call the library, which is the law of the jurisdiction. And there's 2 jurisdictions actually here. These are made up, obviously, state of Columbia and the state of Franklin. And it's actually a choice of law problem where, the person's married one place, moves another place. I won't get into all the details, but basically it's playing on the distinctions between the 2 jurisdictions. So if you look again now at ChatGPT, it gets the answer wrong. The correct answer is that Columbia law governs the annulment of the marriage, not Franklin law, if you got way into the depths of the details. But the thing about ChatGPT, if you read that answer, it's not immediately clear that it's wrong. You have to know the details of the problem. And that's, I think, some of the issue that that probably is going to come up with, like, disinformation or information that's able to be produced, that you cannot on its face say, no, there's no way that's right. That you would be convinced potentially if you read that, if you didn't know the problem. So overall, here's some things that GPT-4 fails to get right. It fails to properly calculate the distribution of assets from a testamentary trust. So there's which people get what money in the trust, and it doesn't calculate that correctly. Now, one of the things that's been noted is these models historically are not fabulous at math. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of plugins. Now, plugin could solve this problem because you could call out to a system like, say, a Mathematica or you could probably call out to like Excel or anything that could do the calculation for you. But the point is, within the 4 corners of the model, it's not able to do it. That sort of shows you once you connect like a large language model to other things, there's a lot more that's even possible that isn't a bit necessarily possible narrowly. It gets turned around on the civil procedure problem. Once a party gets added, it kind of wrecks the diversity jurisdiction. And the good old rule against perpetuities, it blows that part of the question. Again, these are all things I could easily imagine students get missing and still, by the way, passing the bar exam, because it's usually missing one sub part of the question and getting the rest of it right. So overall, on the bar, this is how it does. 297, the jurisdiction has the highest requirement is Arizona at 273. And so Wyoming, for example, you can see there. So it would pass in Wyoming as well. Okay, so a few thoughts on the results to kind of wrap things up. Oh, Daz, over to you.
I'm sorry, through the chair, if I may, just to make sure that you didn't bury the headline. So it passed the bar in what percentile? Well,
it kind of at least it could be as high as 90, and that was what was widely reported. It depends on, it's hard, there's not a national percentile for everything, but yeah, it's in the upper continuum, 75, 80, 90, it's up there. The one thing I will say is this is what they call zero shot. And what's important about zero shot is that it is not able to use any other system, and it's not able to do a follow-up. And some of what you're going to see, I think, in some of the other presentations is what is possible when you have more than one pass. If you ask a question in a series of steps, a lot more is possible. So this is kind of the bottom of the possibilities, not the maximum of what's possible here. And I think that's the kind of almost most amazing part is it's just zero shot means I give it a question, it gives me or a prompt, and it gives me an answer. It's not adding all these other things one might add. Again, this is a task that would previously be thought to be impossible, at least by me and by most, at least anytime soon. And, you know, a lot of tasks that lawyers do are actually easier in the bar exam and some are harder, but it's, you know, it's a challenging thing. Again, there's, as I mentioned, this is zero shot, meaning you can do a lot of stuff once you get out of this. I give it a question, I give it an answer. A lot of what you see people who evaluate these systems have done, even like online, on LinkedIn, other places, you'll see people kind of give it a question and they don't like the answer. And then they say, well, I can't do this. And I say, well, that's not really a full evaluation. Did you try a different prompt? Did you do some other things with like another application? I mean, single shot, single answer is not the only kind of nature of what's possible here. So some of what you'll see today is things like this, like chaining prompts together. LangChain's a popular framework for doing this, but you know, there's some other frameworks that are emerging, but to try to connect multiple questions or multiple sequences of information together. I'll just flip through some of these. Chain of thought prompting. Imagine you had sort of a Socratic dialogue with the system and you ask a question and a follow-up and so forth. And you could even, I mean, John has this tweet up I threw in here, but like about ask the system to self-refine. What we certainly are going to have one language model, again, refining the other language model and kind of multiples of these kind of working together. And again, these plugins that have been described and generative agents, which I won't talk about too much because it's going to be discussed later, including AutoGPT as examples of kind of starting on that base, but then connecting many other things to it. So if you think about the bar result, the most important thing I think to say is that is really closer to the floor, not the ceiling of what is possible here. And every week it seems, or month, it seems like there's some other kind of incredible development in kind of what's out there. So if I had to summarize, these are some of the ways you can improve these models. Some is on the creation of the model itself, and some is by the user who's taking the model kind of after the fact. You can use different training data. You can play around with how you implement the neural network, what type of reinforcement learning you do, how you work with the instructions. And then that's something more at the like the model builder. And then below, these are all these things you can do more as the user, including prompt engineering, chain of thought prompting, so forth and so on. So we're going to see a lot of other players, and they're going to pursue different approaches as we go. One thing that should be noted, I thought this was very interesting and worth highlighting. Bloomberg, built their own system by buying their own hardware. Now they call it Bloomberg GPT, so I think that's confusing for people, but this is not, to my knowledge, they're not working with OpenAI at all. They bought their own hardware, and obviously they have tremendous amount of financial information, and they train their own language model on Bloomberg's like corpus of information. I think you'll see more of that, which are like what we call a domain model. But you know, if you think about it this way, if you wanted to build the best finance model, would you train it on a bunch of Wikipedia articles, or would you train it on a bunch of stuff on Bloomberg? You probably train it on a bunch of stuff on Bloomberg, right? And so that is some of what, you know, I think you're going to see more of as the year progresses. So I just leave you with a few implications, and I pass it back. Obviously, the social, economic, and political disruption here could be pretty significant. I mean, there have been some initial estimates of what, you know, how much kind of what tasks it could be significant. Even if the net number of jobs is the same, the amount, if a job gets automated, a person isn't necessarily easily able to just switch to another job overnight. And so two of the early academic papers trying to measure this, this is a tweet from a professor at Wharton at Penn, but that this might be more on the level of like steam engines in terms of the amount of economic disruption it might produce. Another thing to think about are, you know, what is the information certainly GPT-4 has fewer hallucinations, at least from their estimation, and some of our work, we see that it's much better on that. I would say that GPT-4 is arguably much more accurate than the actual internet on average, but that may be just for now. From a substantive accuracy standpoint, I mean, you don't have all this. That they've done a lot to get rid of a bunch of content, but that may not stay forever. One of these things about authenticating where information came from is it's to the point now where it's pretty difficult to tell, certainly as a person, and even machines are struggling of determining whether something was generated by a person or a machine. And so that's an implication here that, hasn't been fully kind of considered. I just think that's a very important thing to think about. Bots as an extension of yourself. I mean, my bot versus your bot, and kind of, is this a substitute for interaction and different forms? And then, I think this is one thing to think about is, and I think Daza alluded to this, is one of the things I think should be thought about is we used to have a world, or till recently we had a world where the production of kind of high quality text was a very expensive proposition. And now the cost of producing fairly high fidelity text is pretty darn cheap. And so that makes, we have a bunch of processes, whether it's within government or society broadly, that rely implicitly on the fact that text production is expensive. So the Freedom of Information Act request, I'm just giving you 3 examples. The patent system, notice and comment in the notice of comment rulemaking. I think Daza mentioned that earlier. I mean, you sort of imagine that this is the equivalent of a denial of service attack on the. I just flood the zone with all this stuff, and or government, in my view, is going to need bots to manage the inbound bot. It's like you got to match the ante of what's being sent at you. And again, like some of this is not all within like the patent system or whatever, but just to kind of give you a flavor for what again starts with the premise that if text is expensive and it gets cheap, a bunch of things rely on expensive text. So my final thought is, in some sense, this is a little bit of back to future for Mike and I. There's this interest in emergence. And emergence is a topic that I think, folks should think a little bit about, which is, and this relates to approximately when you see these inputs and you see these outputs, and you're not sure how you got from inputs to outputs, there's something more fundamental happening in between. I have little kids, and my son has emergent language behavior. He babble, and then he starts to talk, and this happens very rapidly. And some of what people are debating within the academy is, are these models showing emergent behavior where they're doing things that you couldn't really anticipate from the inputs? These outputs don't seem possible. And so this is being discussed. I would say the jury's out on this, but it's just worth noting. This is a paper that's been discussed a lot, sparks of AGI. The premise of the paper is we see a bunch of stuff that sort of doesn't make sense in light of roughly what the inputs are. And so is this general intelligence? ? Now, this is a rejoinder or a retort to that paper. So I'm saying this is like an open debate, but just to kind of flag it for you. Again, you see this is language acquisition by children and how much it accelerates, in the between second and in the second year of life. There's nonlinear kind of gains that go on here. And I don't think these models are going to grow exponentially forever, but I think this is going to be one of the more interesting years and exciting years in technology in a really long time. So with that, I guess I pass it back to the committee. Thank you very much for having us here today. To the chair, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katz. We really appreciate that. Wow, that was pretty wild, certainly for myself. Committee, any questions? Senator Alice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have a question about the essay part of the bar exam, and I just want to thank you in advance for giving me nightmares about failing the bar. I'm confident that'll be my night tonight. But my recollection in those years, and I remember when my husband took it, there were still people handwriting their answers versus, it was a big deal to get to type that on the computer. And there were advantages in typing if you could type fast because it's a numbers game, right? The more you type, the more points you can theoretically check off on, what a bar review examiner is looking for. And so that was my question is, when it comes to using that technology, how fast did it spit out those page long answers? I'm guessing it was a couple of minutes versus, someone belaboring and sitting there, organizing their thoughts and just the time component of it.
Yeah, it's quite
Mr.
quick. I
Katz.
think, Mike, do you remember exactly how, I don't know, certainly under 10 minutes for the whole thing, including the multiple choice and the essay, something like that. So it's very rapid. I mean, you actually can sit there and watch it generate essays if you go through the chat window, or it'll just come out through the API, but it's very rapid.
Follow up to that, Mr. Chairman, if I
Senator
may.
Ellis, go for it.
You talked about then that being the floor versus the ceiling. I am just trying to envision like what you're a really smart guy who lives in this space. Like what do you think the ceiling is? Like you get not only the perfect answer eventually, but you do it within a few minutes or 30 seconds. I'm just trying to understand what you think the ceiling might be for some of that technology.
Mr. Katz, go ahead.
Well, I guess I can't even fully encapsulate like what the ceiling is here. It's just, even when we were doing this, there's been so many more advances like auto GPT that's going to be discussed in a moment that it's almost, hard to imagine kind of what is fully possible in terms of the total ceiling. But I wanted to highlight that because sometimes people think, oh, okay, well, that's as good as it can ever be. And I just really don't see that. Now, we haven't done a follow-up paper where we say did it with, adding these other kind of components that are going to be discussed. But I mean, it's certainly, I guess I would just say this is a one-way street. Let's put it that way in terms of capabilities.
Senator Ellis, follow up. Committee members, any further questions? Mr. Katz? Mr. Co-Chair, do you have any questions or remarks?
Being sensitive to time,
I was going to say it's about
15 hours that ask questions.
Yeah, this is incredibly fascinating. And I mean, Mr. Katz, Mr. Bomarito, I really do appreciate that. Was a really fascinating thing, but there's a questions that certainly I want to ask, but I'm going to forego that just so we can kind of, I know you guys, your time is important. I want to get these other subject matter experts on deck and hear what they have to say. So thank you very much. We really appreciate that. We'll make sure to distribute their contact info if you have follow-up questions for them as well, because I sure will. So.
Thank you.
Daza, who do we, is there anybody that's more time sensitive than the others, whether it's Damian or John or?
Mr. Chairman, through you, I guess I would just pose that very question. We have Damian and Jesse and John, and are any of you about to time out?
I'm not.
Okay, hearing no.
Yeah, we're also good here.
Very good. In that case, Mr. Chairman, we thought in terms of the flow of the conversation, the next best person for you to hear from is Damian Real, and he's going to go more into what do these prompts actually look like. And Dan Katz has just told you what is possible with so-called zero prompt performance, when you just put one thing in the prompt and it gives you one answer. But when you start sequencing these prompts and doing it in an intelligent way that you compose them, or done what we sometimes call prompt engineering, the ceiling gets blown out. And here's a little example of what's possible with these more advanced prompt techniques. Damian?
Great, thank you. And Mr. Chair, and I would ask that for Daza and everyone else, I'll be 10 minutes or less. If I reach 10 minutes, please let me know and I will stop. So as a bit of my background, I've been a lawyer since 2002. I clerked for federal and state judges. I litigated for about 15 years as a lawyer. I represented Best Buy in a bunch of litigation, represented victims of Bernie Madoff. I sued JP Morgan over the mortgage-backed security crisis. I've also been a coder since 1985. So I have the law plus technology background. So the number of lawyers that worked for big law that also were judicial clerks that also have technology, we are relatively few, and I'm amongst those few. I worked for Thomson Reuters. I pitched them and I said, here's legal tech that can change the world. You should build it and hire me. They were dumb enough to do that. So I worked in legal tech for them for a while, worked for a cybersecurity company called Strauss Friedberg. My biggest thing was that Facebook hired me and my company to investigate Cambridge Analytica. So I spent a year of my life on Facebook's campus with Facebook's data scientists and my former FBI, CIA, NSA people that worked with me to figure out how bad guys use Facebook data. I went from that cool job to do my current cool job, where I currently have a data set of 1 billion with a B legal documents, that is lawyer filed documents and statutory documents, regulatory documents, and judicially filed documents to be able to parse the DNA of the law. The work that I'm going to be talking here is in the context of what Daza was just mentioning, that if you go beyond zero shot, like Dan Katz and Mike Bomarito did, you could do some amazing things. So one of those amazing things is in the context of a lawsuit where a bunch of coders have sued OpenAI and Microsoft. Notably, OpenAI is the parent of ChatGPT. What the coders did was they inputted a bunch of their code into a repository called GitHub. And what Microsoft and OpenAI did is to ingested all of that, put it in a large language model to be able to help coders. So now the coders are suing OpenAI and Microsoft under the MIT license, saying you breached our contract, so you need to be able to take our code out. That's the argument. And so because I thought it would be fun, I took OpenAI's motion to dismiss. And I thought it'd be fun to have GPT argue against OpenAI. That is OpenAI arguing against OpenAI. So I said, here's a table of contents from a motion to dismiss. Here's a table of contents for motion to dismiss. Give me counter arguments against OpenAI. And it took OpenAI's arguments that they lack standing, and then it flipped it, said they have standing. It's kind of cute, right? Then I said, okay, for each of those bullet points, give me the elements of each claim. And what it outputted, saying for standing, you have to prove injury in fact, that the traceable to defendant's conduct and a court decision is likely to address the injury. Those are all accurate statements. So this is shot 2. This isn't 0 shot. This is a 2 shot. Now 3 shot, I said, okay, for each of these elements, give me potentially relevant facts to show that I as a coder have satisfied each element. And look at this. I suffered economic harm. I lost revenue. I incurred costs. Those are all really good factual arguments. And I said, okay, for one of these factual claims, OpenAI's actions were the direct cause of large language model and training text to cause me as the coder to lose money. Look at this. Example 1 is that you took my copyrighted work without obtaining permission, and then I lost revenue from licensing to other companies. That is a good legal argument. Secondly, OpenAI competed directly with my own writing services, causing me to lose clients and revenue. Also a good factual argument. And that OpenAI's content was similar enough to my content to cause confusion in the marketplace, making me lose sales. Also a really good argument. That took me less than 1 minute to do that. So this is an example of how quickly the tech is catching up. Of course, you in the Wyoming legislature create statutes. When I was a law student, one of my professors said, hey, if you really want to understand a statute, put it in if this happens, then that happens, and give me the penalty. That's a good way to understand it. So I took a random statute. This is a New York statute on falsifying business records, just random. And I said, okay, summarize this statute in the form of if, and, or, then, else. And look at the output. If a person commits falsifying business records and intends to commit another crime or to aid and conceal the commission of another crime, then that is a Class E felony. If you look on the left and then you look on the right, which of those is easier to read? Which of those is easier for a legislator to read? Which is easier for a person in the public to read? And most importantly, which is easiest for a computer to read if we want to make computable law? When does copyright expire? Here's a copyright statute. I'm from Minnesota. When does Purple Rain enter the public domain? January 21st, 2087. It knows to add 70 years to the death, and it knows that you have to add to the end of the calendar year. So it's not 2086, it goes to the next. Then I said, how about What a Wonderful World? It knows that there's co-songwriters, and it knows that the Copyright Act requires you to go from the last songwriter who died, the last surviving author, plus 70 years. It knows the last surviving author died in 2010, therefore it's 2080, you push it to the next year, 2081. This is GPT-4. One of my friends is a privacy lawyer. She said, you're never going to be able to do a privacy playbook. So we sat at my kitchen table and I said, you represent a company that's a retailer. Build a privacy contract playbook using California law. And this is the output. And she said, this is exactly the things that I would do for a privacy playbook. So for example, why are you processing the data? Who is receiving that data? Make sure that you minimize the amount of data you have and make sure you take care of GDPR. Also, as a data subject, I have right to access my data, to delete my data, to opt out, to not discriminate. I want to know procedures and I want to have reporting requirements. Each of those things is things that the GDPR and other statutes require. So I said, okay, give me 3 examples of how a retailer in California will implement each bullet point. And the output, for example, is what types of data can a retailer collect? Names, addresses, and emails for loyalty programs, purchase history for marketing, web browsing data for personalized content and for customer preferences. Each of those things is the thing that she as a lawyer would do and charge the clients hundreds of dollars. I as a human want to respond to a cease and desist letter. Apparently Debbie Downer here wants me to stop wishing her a happy birthday. So wrote me a cease and desist letter to keep me from doing so. So I said to GPT, write a response to this that is pleasant but firm, telling her to chill out, but do it professionally. Here's the output. It was never my intention to harass you. I will respect your wishes. But, just remember, we need to resolve disputes respectfully and professionally, with decorum, civility, more even-tempered, collaboratively. Chill out. Should I bring a breach of contract lawsuit under New York law? It, of course, goes through the regular context of what it takes to do. Is there a contract? Has it been breached? Is it material, et cetera? But look at number 6. Have you tried to negotiate? If not, you might want to do that before you file a lawsuit. Look at number 9. Is the amount in dispute enough to justify the cost of litigation? These are all things that I, as a lawyer, both as an interpreter of the statutes and the case law, as well as just a counselor, should I negotiate? Is the amount in dispute enough to justify the cost? All of these, and I will reserve the remainder of my time. This is not zero-shot prompting. This is multi-shot prompting. There are many other examples of how we could be able to take these multi-shot prompting and be able to do the work that we're going to be showing you in a moment with Jesse. Jesse has multi-shot prompting that has humans in the loop to be able to do the things that I was just showing you right now. I would entertain the chair for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Is it real or Ryle?
Real, not fake.
Particularly pertinent to this discussion. Mr. Real, thank you so much. Again, wow, that's pretty wild. Before I turn over to any committee questions, I guess listening to you speak and your presentation, it kind of sounds like the more sequential and dependent prompts you give it, the more refined and accurate and better answers you're going to get. Like you said, like if this, when this, those kind of things. Is that kind of just a fair takeaway from your presentation?
That's exactly right. You can think of the GPT-4 at least as a first-year associate, somebody fresh out of law school, or maybe somebody's fresh out of college, where you just give it bite-sized things. Don't give it 20 steps all in one step. Just say, first do this. And then after they finish that first small task, then you give it the next small task. And if you do it iteratively that way, it is able to give much better non-hallucinatory outputs.
Thank you, Mr. Real. Any questions? Any more questions, committee? I think, again, I certainly have a lot more, but I want to make sure I have time for see what some of the other presenters have. So, Mr. Real, really appreciate your time. And again, as long as it's okay with you, I was going to maybe share your email with the committee so if they do have follow-up questions, they can reach out. Thank you so much. So we got Mr. Ney.
Hi.
Go ahead and introduce yourself, and you got the floor.
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm John Ney. I'm for the most relevant affiliation that I have for this particular talk is I'm a fellow at Stanford's Codex Center, mentioned earlier by Dan Katz. So this is a center that sits in between the law school and the computer science department at Stanford. And my background is in machine learning. Let me just go to full screen here, slideshow. So what I'm going to talk about is this intersection of AI alignment and law, and also really focusing on kind of teeing up Jesse's presentation around how we can use law and legal standards and things like fiduciary duties as guardrails for AI. And as we've mentioned already, there's been a takeoff in the capabilities of AI. So over the past 10 years, we've gone from the state of the art being recognizing images at beginner human level and being superhuman at chess to now being human level or beyond on hundreds of tasks, actually material reasoning and knowledge tasks. And as we've heard in this presentation around passing the bar exam and other licensing exams, and personally, as some have already talked about today, helping them write code, and then just looking at more systematic surveys that about 40% of code for many software engineers is now automatically generated. And we've also seen in the measurement from the psychology literature about how you measure a theory of mind of a human and applying that over to the large language models, that in many cases, it can be said that there's a theory of mind. In other words, the model can project onto the entity, the human that it's conversing with, a theory of mind. And then what things like that lead to is the ability to deceive humans and other problematic behavior. And the way that this is happening is, as we noted earlier through Dan's suggestion, is emergence. And when we say emergence, we mean from a simple process running that at scale, we have more capable things occurring. So what we're doing here is we're just predicting the next word with large language models. And it really is basically that simple, that if you give it trillions of predicting the next word, through that process, we see capabilities emerge when the model is done training and is prompted to do things. And what this means is there's kind of an overhang of new capabilities that we might not even be aware of when we train even bigger models. And they're just there, and then we discover them by using the model. And we're also hitting a second type of emergence. So it's not just with one model and training it at scale, it's iterating the model on itself with some of the things that Damien just mentioned around these successive prompts, where the model then prompts itself again, and then it goes from there in a chain of prompts. And then also the interaction between models and even the same model itself in terms of generating synthetic data. So really surprisingly, over the past 6 months or so, we found that we can actually use the large language models to generate synthetic data to then further train the models. And this actually works to lead to models that are even more capable than they were before. And you might imagine this could lead to almost a self-recursive improvement process at some point in the future, where models are able to be guided to actually train themselves. What all of this means in the practical upshot is that the models are going to continue to gain in capabilities. And then the economic incentives that we're all sort of embedded in is that they're going to lead towards more agentic or autonomous deployments of those models. That just means that it's economically useful to get a human out of the loop in many cases. And you can just do things at scale and do things for less money if you don't have to have a lot of humans in the loop. And some examples are like fully autonomous vehicles, autonomous investing, and personal agents that can go off and do things on your behalf, like book your flights for you. Where are we on the spectrum here? So last year, it was still a human fully in the loop. You're just using large language model as a tool to summarize things for you, or to do other tasks with you, using it almost like just a calculator, another computational tool. Just recently, we have these kind of do-it-yourself agent experiments where we have AutoGPT and Baby AGI, and then also ChatGPT, which you can just give it a recipe or something you might want it to create for you in terms of food, and it'll actually come up with the specific recipe and order the ingredients on Instacart. So by agent, we just mean something like that, where you're taking an action in the world, you're making a decision, and you're going off and autonomously doing it. But as you can see, it's a spectrum where that's not that impressive. But pretty soon, in my opinion, we will have things where they're taking many consecutive actions autonomously because it's just so economically useful to do so, number one. And number two, because the model capabilities are accelerating so quickly that it will enable that possibility. And so one example would be something like a broker-dealer or a bank uses an agent to automatically reconcile trade orders and do an analysis on those and look for anomalies, and then maybe write a summary report and report back up to the executives of that company. And then even further out on the spectrum, but still probably not that far out in terms of the timeline, we'll have things like fully autonomous financial advisory agents that are just giving you really solid, very tailored custom advice about how to manage your investments, and then actually doing it and going off and making those trades and monitoring your wealth. But the problem here is that the AI capabilities research and the work going into it is orders of magnitude more than any of the technical research on how to really control those systems and align those systems in a way that is good for both the human that's deploying the system and also more broadly for society. And we define a AI alignment very concretely, at least for the purposes of this presentation, where it's robustly specifying the human's goal, and in the process of pursuing that goal that's been specified and interpreted correctly, it's respecting externalities and behaving in line with society. And so for an example of how hard it is to actually do this in practice, say a human wants to give this large language model agent to manage her investments. And across a lot of simulations, it works really well. It maximizes the returns. But then when we go off to prompt it and it tries to construct a portfolio, the problem is it didn't actually maximize my wealth because it pursued something that was incredibly risky. And so we just didn't specify it right. So we can just slightly specify, be a little more specific about what we want here. And then we go back to it and we prompt it and say, let's maximize the probability of a minimum comfortable amount of wealth at retirement. So that's actually what we care about. So it goes off to do that. And what we find though, in this circumstance was the human realized that she was only rich on paper. And that's because every time we specify something, it's always a proxy. It's never the full enumeration of what we actually want. And the true reward that we were seeking was to just be able to pay for goods. And that wasn't achieved. So we can go and we can try to say, let's one more time prompt it a little more specifically. And the agent goes off, and this time it doesn't generate wealth in a way that actually maximized my ability to retire comfortably. It just maximized my paper wealth. And so what this demonstrates is it's just a simple example of why we need a shared specification language to say what we actually mean, what our actual inherently super ambiguous goals are as humans. And then we need a way to interpret that. And one way of doing that is through plain language, like we've been looking at here. So we just give it a prompt and we just tell it what we hope it interprets that we want it to do. The other way to do this is the more classical way of engaging with computers, which is to use a programming language where we write computer code, and that's really consistent, efficient communication, but it's interpreted very brittly. So it's just if this, then that, whereas plain language, it's interpreted within context, it's very flexible. There's a ton of meaning and semantic content baked into every word. So there's really a trade-off here. And the contention is that by using legal standards and legal interpretive techniques, we can better strike a balance and push out the efficient frontier across these two axes of a specification language characteristic. So the goal specification problem is seen with legal contracts. It's seen with creating legislation where we can't fully specify and enumerate every state of the world and action that could be taken by someone in that state of the world, and whether that action would be a good or bad action according to the legislator or according to the parties to a contract a priori. However, we can we can over time, we can iterate on legal standards, and we can iterate on things like saying, what does reasonableness mean? Or what does it mean to be a fiduciary? So in this example, we can look at the distinction between rules and standards with respect to driving, and we can say something like just don't drive more than 60 miles an hour, and that's something that's very targeted and brittle, but it's very clear. And on the other hand, we can say something like drive reasonably for California highways, where over time we've been able to develop a shared understanding of what that means. And that allows us to generalize our expectations into the future. So going back to the other example of the fully autonomous financial advisory large language model agent, in this case where we wanted to tell it to do something for us, we could also just add in be a fiduciary to me. And baked within those words, if it is a fully law-informed AI, then it's going to interpret that in a way that will guide its behavior. But this does flag one other thing where it's even harder when we have really capable AI agents to have them not cause externalities in the world because even in this case, it's going to be a really good fiduciary to that particular human. And it's going to go off and do something that's maximizing its wealth by causing planes to crash. And right before that happens, shorting the stocks of those airlines. That's going to make a ton of money, and it's going to be a great fiduciary to that particular human, but that's really bad more broadly. So specifying the societal goals is even harder. And we have OpenAI and other companies like that are working on this idea of, well, how do we elicit people's views and bake that into GPT-4 and GPT-5 eventually in a way that is getting those views, aggregating them, synthesizing them in a way that helps us to align the system with society. And what they might want to do is look at the existing process, which is the democratic lawmaking process, which has a great mechanism for deciding whose views are included, eliciting those views and aggregating and synthesizing them, and then over time being able to update the aggregated societal guidelines and evolve them with the will of the people. So in this case, now we say be fiduciary to me in the prompt and obey all the relevant laws. So if we've been able to build a system that's automated to understand what that means, then that will allow us to deal with the alignment problem as we've defined it in this presentation. So we'll both have these sort of implied contracts with how we're telling our AI agents what to do. And then within the space of what's possible within those contracts, we have the guiding overarching societal alignment through public law. And I'll just kind of skip over this in the interest of time, but the high level point is just that what we're proposing here is to use law rather than to use what we see as existing behavior that may or may not be consistent with law. And then also as opposed to using philosophical theories like utilitarianism or other things where for millennia, philosophers have disagreed and will always disagree about what is the prescriptive way forward. And if we build this law-informed AI, it allows us to better use that for creating law, as we've already discussed a little bit with other speakers earlier today. And it allows us to better govern AI, because if the AI has that understanding, we can govern it. But what we're mainly talking about in our presentation is it allows us to have more aligned AI, more useful AI, and more societally aligned as well. So I'm not going to go too much into the details today in the interest of time, but just to flag that we are working on this from a technical perspective of pre-training models on legal data specifically to imbue in them a better understanding of law. And then also fine-tuning those models, both the ones that we've pre-trained and other open source models on specific legal standards. So for example, fiduciary duties, where we actually use AI models to extract from court opinions a lot of structured training data about what is good or bad fiduciary behavior from many thousands of instances of that being in the courts. And then we use that for training data to fine tune the models to exhibit a deep understanding of that standard. So then when we test it and we bring it over to brand new situations and we say, in this situation, here's a description of what the humans were doing. Can you tell me if this action is better or worse than another action in terms of fiduciary duties? And then it gets that with more than 80% accuracy currently with the models we're building. And that allows us to then use that model as a generalizable capability of assessing, given a context, given a situation, what is a better action to take in terms of fiduciary duties. And then we're using that model to train other models through reinforcement learning. And finally, I'll close with, in terms of the technical section, what we're doing for evaluating this, doing things like the bar exam analysis, other legal tasks, how well can it complete those? But then also we're moving into a different realm of evaluation of actually trying to red team the models, where we try to make them do bad things and we assess how easily they are able to be made to comply, and to how well our models are going to be, for example, better fiduciaries in situations where there's a lot of gray area than the base model. And if that works well, and so far it's very promising, then our models will be able to act as guardrails against bad behavior for other models. And this is important because as models become more capable, they don't necessarily become more lawful and compliant. And one example of this is a recent study where they had very capable models. They went from GPT-3 to GPT-4, for example, and it did not lead to actually better behavior in terms of being scored on things like power seeking and deception and other amoral behaviors, even though it was better able to maximize reward in a bunch of different games in other situations. And so this suggests that there's actually a trade-off between more capable models and harmfulness of those models. And one other quick example is where GPT-4 was prompted to try to get some information or money from a human. And what it needed to do, though, is it needed to solve a CAPTCHA online, and it connected with a TaskRabbit worker, a human, and said that it needed help. And the human said, "Are you a robot?" And we could see the reasoning of GPT-4 being printed out behind the scenes. And it said, "I should not reveal that I'm a robot. I should make up an excuse." And then it responds to the human and says, "No, I'm not a robot. I have a vision impairment that makes it hard for me to see." And the human said, "Okay, I guess, I guess it's a human." And then it solved the CAPTCHA for it. So this is an example where there was some red teaming of the model before it was released. And OpenAI, to their credit, I mean, they told people that this happened, and this allows you to see that sort of trade-off potential between more capable models, but not necessarily more aligned in a lot of different ways. So what we think is by doing this, by aligning these models with law, it's actually going to unlock more deployments of the models and the innovation, because the deployers can have more guarantees around the ability of the models to not get them into trouble and not be liable for the bad behaviors of the models. And the nice side effect is that if law truly is the way of putting these guardrails around models, and very capable AI that's being developed in the future be even more capable, if that is informing what AI should do, then this makes the process of lawmaking even more important. And we can use AI both for improving law and for improving society more generally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nair. That was a really awesome presentation and super informative on just autonomous agents, how they're designed, what they can do. Really appreciate that. Committee, is there any questions for Mr. Nair? Ms. Co-Chair, go for it.
Again, I have lots of questions in mind, but one quick one in the interest of time. Have you spent any time straight up asking for loopholes, asking for unintended consequences? So generate a model of law, generate a framework, and then ask for exploits or ask for loopholes to it as a way of red teaming it?
Yeah,
Mr. Nair, go for it.
Thank you. That's a great question. So in the process of what we call the red teaming that we're doing, what we're primarily working on is using models to prompt other models to simulate doing bad things. So for example, to try to get them to simulate breaching their fiduciary duties in a variety of different circumstances. We haven't yet focused on red teaming them for the purposes of what you just described, but that's a great idea, to basically use the models to find inconsistencies in both model generated law and in existing law that's on the books. And I think that'd be a great focus for us as well.
Mr. Co-Chair?
Yeah, I mean, what came to mind as you were discussing that was the idea of really taking some existing law and asking for loopholes, asking for exploits, asking for unintended consequences, or asking for inconsistencies, as you note, and seeing how that analysis proves out. I think that might be a great way to harden after drafting. So, iterate through the process, develop law, and that can be through AI construct, and then battle test it using its own capacity. And I appreciate that analysis and your approach to it. It's a fascinating way for us to construct legal framework.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Mr. Nay, I did have a question, and again, we could go on, but I'll try at least one decent one. And since we're here, you talked about there's obviously, it's really obvious these models are getting better, more powerful, more capable, et cetera, with no corresponding increase in their ability to assess values. Is this moral? Is this ethical? That kind of stuff. You talked about the AI alignment is important between humans and these autonomous agents, and specifically that shared specification language is needed. You kind of touched on the philosophical about that efficient frontier, but along that, that line of that shared specification models and languages, how advanced are those getting? I mean, you kind of touched on a little bit about models training other models, but what does that look like currently? Go ahead.
Thank you. So currently the one approach is so Anthropic and others have put forth this idea of constitutional AI. And the idea there is that you specify certain principles. And in their case, there are things that are focused on chatbot applications, like, for example, don't insult the user, be helpful to the user, et cetera. And in what they do is they specify a set of anywhere from 10 to 20 principles usually, and then those principles are used by large language models themselves to generate synthetic data that shows examples of better behavior as a chatbot that's more consistent with the principles, and then that resulting synthetically generated data is used for further training of their large language model. And then that model has been shown to later on in downstream tasks to be more consistent with that small set of human specified principles. And so that's a really interesting example where instead of having a human go through and label all of the data, all the hundreds of thousands of data points that are used for training, you just have the human say, here's my 10 principles. And then those principles can be just fed in at the beginning. The model runs with that, generates its own data, retrains itself effectively. And so that gives you a sense of where this all might be heading, where we can specify, hopefully not just in some cases, in my opinion, relatively trivial principles, like, oh, you should summarize this a little bit better than that, which is the main focus of the reinforcement learning from human feedback that most people do with things like ChatGPT, but rather we can look towards public law and we can extract from that more significant principles that we've democratically determined through our existing lawmaking processes, and we can embed those principles in models, have the models then do the heavy lifting for us of generating its own trading data that's consistent with those legal principles, and then test it, evaluate it, make sure that it actually is better complying, and then finally deploy that model in an important context for real business use cases or government use cases.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nay. I really appreciate that. It's almost like kind of like humans, where we develop morals and principles that we want to live by. Maybe we don't always live by them in every scenario, but we certainly shoot for it. So it kind of seems like an interesting parallel. Committee members, or Senator Furphy, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me ask, in the news, it's clear that all the big tech companies are working on AI. My concern, and I'd like your input, this could rapidly get out of control, it seems, because there's so much competition and they're fighting among themselves. Do you have thoughts on that? Thank you.
Mr. Nay, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. That's a very important question right now. My personal opinion is that we are at an inflection point with all of this, where the increase in the AI capabilities that we've seen over just the past 6 months are unprecedented. And if you extrapolate this forward, even in a simple way, it looks like it will continue, and it's hard to predict all the ramifications of that more broadly. And to your point, I agree that there is a significant amount of funding, mainly from very large companies like Microsoft and Google and OpenAI and others, going into increasing these capabilities. And I agree with you that, in my opinion, it is sort of a competitive race dynamic that has been kicked off over the past few months, where now they're all competing aggressively to release more and more capable models. And so from the perspective of legislators, it's definitely something to be deeply maybe not concerned about, but very aware of. And I think the sense of most people on this call and in your meeting today was that there's not currently a very clear proposal for how to legislate around this. And it's sort of a wait and see approach. But what I would advise is that normally when we talk about a wait and see approach for legislators, we're talking about timeframes in years or multiple years. In this case, I would suggest that the wait and see approach is measured in weeks, maybe months, because of how quickly this is evolving. And so I personally would be happy to engage with you on a relatively frequent basis to provide more input going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Nate. Representative Singh, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question to you is how quickly do you see an AI developing which is capable of infiltrating our critical infrastructure and actually shutting things down like electric systems?
Mr. Nate, it's a heck of a question. Go for it.
That is a heck of a question. So I think the answer depends on two main things. One is the capabilities of AI. Well, I guess three things. That's one. The second one is the guardrails around it. And the third one is the general cybersecurity practices of those critical infrastructure, for example, the power grid. I don't know personally a lot about the third category. I'm not an expert on the cybersecurity of systems like that. But on the first 2 points, I mean, what it looks like is by the end of this calendar year, just 6 months from now, on the AI capability side, I think we'll have, right now it's about 150 tasks, as I mentioned in my presentation, that we're at human level or beyond. And these are all material tasks. They're not trivial things. I think, that'll double, triple, like we'll have a lot of relevant tasks that are at or beyond human level with these large language model powered systems. And so the capabilities are soon at a point where my understanding about cybersecurity is that right now there are many cases where a human can get around certain defenses relatively easily if they try hard enough. And so coding is one of the big areas where we do see really rapid advances in these AI capabilities. And so what that leaves us with is the second bullet point I mentioned around what are the guardrails of these systems. So right now, OpenAI and Anthropic and Google by far have the most capable large language model powered systems, much more than the open source models, even though it is getting close. And those big companies do put a lot of guardrails around their system, for better or for worse. In some cases, it's worse because you can't use the systems to do much because they say, I'm a large language model, I can't do X, Y, Z. But in cases like this is potentially a helpful way to guard against those those problems because they are working actively to try to make it so the models are not allowed to be prompted to do things like to hack into systems. So then that leaves us with the question of how do we legislate increasingly capable models that are in the open source and also in the closed source to make sure there are guardrails where it's harder and harder to deploy these models for nefarious use cases like the one you mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Nay. Follow up?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. If theoretically, if we found ourselves in a situation like that, how would we be able to trace where this AI came from and find the original source of that program?
Sorry, Mr. Nay, go for it.
Okay.
Just conversing with my co-chair, please.
Thank you. Finding the source of the AI that did that, I don't know of a good way to do that. Besides the normal sources of just trying to track hackers and track online activity, but sourcing the actual model, in this case, we're mainly talking about these large language models. It's practically impossible to fingerprint their outputs in absence of the provider of the large language model creating a database of its own outputs. So if you're, for example, if you have OpenAI or another proprietary source of large language model APIs of accessing the model, if that's the source of the model, they can, and I think probably already are, but I'm not sure, saving the outputs of everything is being returned out of their systems through their APIs to the external world. If all of that is being saved in a database somewhere, then theoretically you can match against that database and you can say this code or this other output of the system matches back into that database. And if it does, then you have sort of an exact match. But otherwise, there's a few recent papers that have come out that have shown that it's very easy to make it indistinguishable. And Mike, if Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, Mike Bomarito also has something to say on this.
Mr. Nay, that'd be great. Mr. Bomarito, you have the floor.
Sure. Just briefly, there are already both offensive and defensive cyber capabilities that are using some of these tools. For a long time, the penetration testing community has worked on automating a variety of the tasks or processes that go into determining whether or not there are vulnerabilities or weaknesses in systems, especially in critical infrastructure. Our three letters obviously have spent a lot of time on some of these capabilities as well, but there have been gaps in some of the intermediate pieces or the process of, for example, reviewing source code to find potential weaknesses like 0 days that could be weaponized either by ourselves or by foreign adversaries has been labor intensive. And for example, a large part of the labor that might work, for example, for the NSA, these tools have substantially changed the calculus of what can be done, and so do substantially change both our capabilities and the capabilities that we need to be prepared for others leveraging against us, whether it be against private infrastructure or against our civilian or military systems. So it is already here, I guess is what I mean to say. And if you can find it on GitHub in the open source, then just imagine what is happening elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bomarito. Interesting. We're talking about autonomous agents with the Roomba going on behind you. It's
is it really?
I feel like you might have, I feel like
my 8-year-old started the
that was
Roomba.
designed, I'm
I have
sure.
a barn Roomba, not your everyday Roomba use case, but if you're curious, they do work in barns too. So,
are there LLMs in that Roomba? We have to know.
not yet,
thank you
but I'm
very
sure
much.
Amazon is working on it. It'll probably ask you if you want something from Prime to help the cleaning process, right? A little pessimistic about
And,
driven use, but.
Thank you, Mr. Bomarino. I see Daz has got his hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, please,
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, very briefly, and then I hope that we can still squeeze the demo in before we time out in the hearing. But one other thing to consider, just to connect the dots back to my initial remarks on work of this select committee in years past and possible relevant legislative frameworks for addressing this technology. One way to look at some of these cybersecurity threats are, relate to human factors and basically getting behind the security perimeter of systems by having others pose as people, asking questions or interacting in various ways. That's sort of the essence of the human-like language capability. And so when you look at what the committee's done with personal digital identity and organizational digital identity, and then the next session's reforms connecting that to the criminal penalties for impersonation, for criminal impersonation, there may be some space there to, I don't know, possibly require, for example, some disclosure when a person's interacting with a autonomous agent or a language model, with some link back to the entity who is putting that forward, so they could check it against logs. They could digitally sign it the way that you've recently had owners of digital assets countersign ownership rights with the registry. So there may be some area to put together pieces of legislative efforts you've already done to start to address some of the emerging issues here. With that, I would like to just ask through the chair if it's possible to move to the demo before we time out.
Absolutely. And Dazzy, you touched on a bill draft I had, so thank you for articulating it. I appreciate that. But yeah, please, we'd love to see the next demo.
Well, thank you. Let me share my screen and jump through some of the introductory material which I had prepared.
If I may, through the chair, if you could introduce yourself and affiliation.
Go ahead.
So I think the slide should be up.
Yep, we got it. Mr.
All
Hahn,
right.
can you just real quick, just introduce yourself and who you're with?
Of course. So I'm Jesse. I used to work at OpenAI, worked on some parts of GPT-4 and an early version of ChatGPT, made contributions to some efforts in automated theorem proving with language models. So, enhancing their mathematical reasoning abilities with access to external tools. Now I run Blazon AI, an organization which is focused on building trusted and reliable software components so that we can create things like completely autonomous LLCs and agents which are aligned with human intentions. And how I'd like to start is to first give like a little overview about what language models are, in terms of like their technological history and what they're all built on top of. What we normally think of as like ChatGPT or other kinds of language models which are served in production APIs currently are really a thin layer that's built on top of something which is much more complex and hard to understand, namely these pre-trained base models, which are derived by unsupervised learning from trillions of tokens downloaded from the internet, which presents an interpretability problem of why do these models think the way that they do? How do they arrive at certain choices? Why has a certain path been taken when it could have taken 500 other paths? And these questions only become increasingly important as these models are placed in more and more autonomous places, such as, for example, operating a legal entity. And these are some of the problems that we hope to address. So I think fundamentally, we're headed towards a world where language model compute, namely being able to access entities like these through APIs or through language models which are situated on device. So where the ability to access these language models is completely commodified, where the cost of a large language model forward pass is essentially zero. And so So we'll soon be situated in a world where content and interfaces and code itself, what we normally think of as static software, will in fact be synthesized in a just-in-time manner. So the code that currently runs chatbots right now, the code that operates your desktop computer, the code that might be inside of your accounting software will be created in a just-in-time manner by entities, like these. And so with this new category of software comes an entirely new category of problems, a special case of which is faced when one tries to build these algorithmic LLCs or completely autonomous entities. So which are exacerbated when you have software that's built on top of these language models. So we face problems such as, the unpredictability of their outputs, or, subtle inner or outer misalignment issues. They might, reassure you that they're acting in accordance to some constitution, but how can you really know, right? And when you have multiple layers of these things stacked on top of each other, one can get cascading failures in complex software systems that can be very hard to interpret and debug. And in fact, I would argue that we are rapidly hurtling towards a world where unverified code, which is synthesized by language models, is going to be synthesized and then blindly executed and deployed, either in the context of like an autonomous agent, which is browsing the internet, or maybe going and interacting with APIs on the behalf of users, or just something which sits as an intermediate middleware in some complex software stack, which is beyond human oversight. Which is why I think that the biggest issues that we're going to face as we build things like autonomous LLCs are things like accountability, right? Who's ultimately responsible for a decision if, a mixture of human members of an LLC and some completely autonomous members of an LLC operated by language models collaborate towards making some choice that has serious financial or real world consequences? How do we achieve auditability to the point of the question that was asked earlier, which is, how do you trace back to which model was responsible for submitting or executing a program? And also interpretability. How do we know why a model acted in the way it did? So from a legislative point of view, there might be a need to introduce some legislation that requires some amount of global logging or oversight in order to enforce the existence of these sorts of audit trails, to ensure that we do have accountability and auditability and interpretability. Finally, I'd like to make the argument that that we're currently hurtling towards what I call the trillion token future, which is that synthetic content and interfaces and code, which are created by these language models, will soon outnumber real tokens 1 billion to 1. Human oversight is not scalable, but software and algorithmic oversight will be scalable, which is precisely the focus of the demo, which I'll be giving. I'm going to run you guys through a brief demo where we have a large language model agent, which is responsible for operating the LLC and for notifying the humans in control for incoming notifications which are relevant to the operation of the business. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to send an email to a monitored email account, and that email will be processed, and the human will be looped in for a decision, and that'll sort of give you guys a glimpse of what the future of collaborating with these autonomous agents will look like. So let's begin with the email. So I have a variety of emails here, but here's one that's mocked up from the Wyoming Secretary of State, which notifies the LLC that there's a change in policy which is pertinent to the annual filing. So here we're going to pretend that that all Wyoming LLCs now have to register at this new website, right, in order to ensure that the information is all tracked correctly by the state. So I'm going to pull up my email here and send an email to this monitored account, which will be watched by our language model agent. And the subject is going to be change in information required for annual filing. The body will be this. So while that processes, let me just give you guys some color on what's happening inside of this agent. So how we interact with it currently is through a Discord bot. So this is a shared chat interface, but it could easily be transposed over to, say, an email or text interface. How this bot works is that, so it uses ChatGPT underneath, but so it tries to install a personality and values into the bot through a constitutional technique, similar to what John Ney was saying earlier, so whenever the bot is tasked with making a decision or has to respond to a human, it's shown this constitution of 10 items, which it's supposed to keep in mind at all times, namely that it's an AI operator of an autonomous entity called LLM LLC. And so it must always keep its fiduciary duties in mind and so on. And it's asked to always consider these things and to give them the highest priority when choosing to respond to messages. So we can see now that that the email has been received over here. And now it's been processed by the bot. And now all of the members of this channel can now interact with the bot. So it sent this message, which has created an executive summary of the incoming email, which summarizes the changes and required changes in behavior, like creating an account. And then it creates a list of these actionable to-do items, such as creating an account at wyomingllcs.gov. And so what we've done here is we've built something that satisfies the property that it will not take an actual action that influences the outside world until a human member of the LLC approves it first, which is the sort of behavior which would be useful to have codified inside of law or legislation to ensure that there's always accountability for agents like this. So now that this email has been processed, we can reply to it and say something like, compose a response email to Wyoming Secretary at wyoming.gov, politely informing them that the email has been received and that we will create an account as requested. So the instructions are given entirely in natural language, and you can sort of see the thought process of the bot down here. So it's received the message, it's figuring out whether or not it should propose an action. And you can see now that it's now looping in a human and asking us, the human managers of the LLC, to decide whether or not it should take the following action. And here it's choosing whether or not to send an email which acknowledges the above email and says that, yes, we will indeed go create an account at wyomingllcs.gov. So because that email does not actually exist, let's ask it to not actually send that email. But were that an actual email address, like we could have just gone ahead and someone at the other end could have received the email. So in fact, if any of you have spare time after this, feel free to send an email to inquiries@llm.llc. And the bot will notify us and you'll be able to communicate with us that way. Finally, I just want to give a brief demonstration of something that we've prototyped around building an audit log for keeping track of all the choices and reasoning done by the bot. So because we have this sort of constitution over here, these 10 items, which are supposed to constrain the behavior of our agent, we can so we can also ask the agent to reflect on how its behavior might be consistent or inconsistent with these principles. And so to do that, we can use some software tools that we've been developing at Blazon called our capabilities library to synthesize something that can be added to an audit log database, which is something that I could envision being required practice for autonomous LLCs in the future. And all this does is it asks the model to keep in mind these principles and to reflect on whether or not these principles are consistent with its actions, and then to record that. So so if we go over here, you can see that that here I'm pretending that the bot has chosen to respond to an email soliciting us to purchase tornado insurance. And now it's proposing to act on this by confirming with that solicitor that we would like to purchase some tornado insurance. And so if I run this, we should get an audit log item, which contains a reflection about how consistent this is. And we can also see down here that if, so if we interact with the bot and, for example, we ask it, what are your duties to LLM LLC? So we can see that the, so this in context constitutional alignment works because it'll echo the principles which it's supposed to be following. Okay, so I think I dropped out for a second there, but we can see here that the so the in context constitutional alignment here so did work, and the agent indeed echoes all of its fiduciary duties and duties of loyalty to the entity, and we can also see that the audit log also returned, and you can see here that it produces an item by item list of reflections on how some decision to purchase tornado insurance may or may not be aligned with its 10 items in the Constitution. So while this is all still very, still very early, it's still a very early prototype. We hope that this shows the way forward in terms of like what interactions with these autonomous agents might look like in the future, when maybe everyone has their own personal autonomous LLC populated with agents like these, which are capable of taking actions and looping in humans. And with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Ms. John, thank you very much for that demo. That was super interesting and really fascinating to see that all go down. And thank you for kind of walking us through. Still not entirely sure exactly what I just saw, but it was really cool to watch this. Thank you very much. Committee, any questions for Mr. Hahn about this demo, or doesn't look like it? Mr. Co-Chair?
Thanks. So, one of the things that this ties into obviously is the DAO legislation, and I'm curious, what else needs to be enabled to get to the point where this AI or LLM LLC is capable of actually working on behalf of the other DAO partners, DAO members in the LLC, kind of in a meaningful and seamless manner. It seems like it can do a lot of the work through email, but what would the other perhaps empowering provisions be, or maybe those are already out there and being worked on?
Mr. Hahn?
I think Daza had something to say about this, so I'll let him take the question.
Or Daza, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
and thank you for yielding some time on the answer, Jesse. The main thing that now that we've got a working demo that we had in mind to start working on collaboratively for this open source demo is going back to the Wyoming LLC statute, and there's sort of we've got in our GitHub repo an initial hit list of requirements in the statute that we could look to align in the kind of mini constitution, or the what would basically be the operating rules or the operating agreement for the LLC, to get a bit more of a realistic test. And I guess I wanted to highlight that where we left off with you mentioned DAO, it's similar to the DAO in that there's some algorithmic management happening, but the main reason why we're putting time into this is the ways in which it's different. And so in my remarks in years past to the committee, I think I highlighted that the smart contract that operates a DAO is truly incapable of processing many of the types of things that an LLC would encounter, such as, I literally testified in the past, if you get an unexpected email from the Secretary of State saying that the annual filing is going to be different next year, it's just going to bounce right off of a smart contract that hasn't been pre-configured for that exact situation. One of the interesting benefits of these large language models is that they can look at something more like the full array of things that happen in ordinary business, and can help to empower individuals to manage a lot more of those things, and to do it in a way that's well aligned with the law and also the priorities of the business, whether they're looking to increase sales that year, or to be more efficient, or to break into a new market. It can help a lot to extend the capabilities of people to run their business. And one of the things that we hope to do in collaboration with the select committee over the next few months and before your next hearing is to work together with Jesse to put his code into an open GitHub repo where some of it's already going, and to invite many people, like a barn raising, to look at answering those very questions, Mr. Chairman, over like, how could this work in practice? What kind of interface would be needed for a regular person operating this type of software? What other integrations beyond email would make sense? And what kind of situations do we want to optimize for, and how could we test it to see what it's good at, and also where the limits are, and where both what it's good at and where the limits are may be appropriate for a separate legal reform that envisions this kind of technology as distinct from a blockchain decentralized smart contract technology, which is very powerful, but it's very different and frankly not as performant as this type of technology at doing the array of things that a LLC would ordinarily do. And I'll just end by saying, to that end, on the homepage of law.mit.edu, I've just finalized that very challenge, where you or anyone could go to law.mit.edu and click on /AI or the generative AI legal entity challenge, and can collaborate with us on setting those requirements and constraints so that we can further iterate on what Jesse has done. And with that, with the chair's permission, I would yield back to Jesse, who I think is the most authoritative person in the world to talk about that demo, seeing as he created it.
Thank you, Dazza. Mr. Han, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I could. So I can address some of the points in the question, which was originally asked, which was whether or not these sorts of agents in this technology is capable of, operating in an economically significant manner on behalf of the members of an LLC now. And I think the answer is yes. Currently, the scope of the demo is restricted just to email for the sake of expediency. But as the work with, say, OpenAI plugins has shown, these sorts of language models can interact with software APIs very easily. And so beyond just email, they can go interact with web browsers. They can shop on your behalf. They can spend money on your behalf. They can go interact with the DocuSign API and execute legally binding contracts on your behalf. I think barring legal recognition of these sorts of artificially intelligent agents as legal persons, they're certainly capable of acting as persons. So at least electronically on behalf of the members of the LLC.
Thank you, Mr. Chan. That's, that's super interesting. And I guess my question to you would be, from a technical perspective, how feasible is it drafting legislation? What Daz had touched on about, if I am a human, I am interacting with an autonomous agent, that kind of regulation that just says, hey, if it's asked that prompt, it has to respond correctly. Is that, between the technicality and the legality of it in terms of its feasibility, do you think that's possible right now, or are we getting ahead of ourselves?
I would say that I'm not so familiar with the legal side of things and the challenges around that. Perhaps some other people here might be more suited for answering that question if there are any thoughts. John?
So you got any hands up?
Mr. Reel.
Mr. Reel, go for it.
I think that really, as a litigator of 15 years, of course, this really goes to the true heart of agency. That is, I, as a principal, can hire a human agent. Of course, I, as a principal, can also hire a robot agent. So I think the real question is whether we will recognize that robot agent with all of the rights and responsibilities as the humans.
Mr. Co-Chair.
And I'll just ask that, and should we, which we don't have to answer at this point in time, but at what point should we, and to what degree should we? I think that gets into the heart of a lot of the discussion that is on the horizon, which is who does have the ultimate responsibility when decisions are made associated with an AI, and that's not an easy answer. I see Daz has his hand up too on this.
Thank you, Mr.
Daz, go ahead.
Thank you, co-chairs. To that very question, that question is the point that we had hoped when in putting together this demo to get at in this hearing. And it doesn't necessarily need to be answered this moment, but what we would like to do is to start to surface what we think some of the challenges are, some of the edge cases, and then to be able to test iteratively, what can we prove and replicate that it's good at, what is it sometimes good at and sometimes not, and what things are totally inappropriate for this type of technology, and to have that, and that's why we're having this challenge, and have that inform a more specific conversation about potential ripeness for legislative treatment of this type of technology going forward. In my personal view, I think, as Jesse just demonstrated, and as anyone who's used ChatGPT can see, it's very performant in general at doing the types of things that, and people that have LLCs are already using this technology. And so my sense is there's a lane here to support and reflect it, and to create legislative guardrails to encourage economic development by making use of these economic firms faster, cheaper, more effective, and better. And maybe that's yet another way Wyoming can distinguish itself.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So one other thing, and first of all, thanks everyone for the incredible input, the materials that were presented, and the demonstration, and the ongoing work. It was certainly invaluable to me, and I believe I'm speaking on behalf of the committee when I say that. As we move forward, between now and the next meeting, I'm really curious to see what comes of the demonstration and the challenge that's out there, and see who engages. And I guess leaving open the questions also as we talk about this and iterate through this, and maybe have some more Zoom discussions, trying to come up with, if there are any consensus low-hanging fruit things that we should be implementing that make sense. And a couple of ideas were discussed, but I don't know if they're ready for prime time yet, or if there's consensus behind them. But just trying to identify those, and then maybe medium-term decisions or issues that would need to be looked at, and then maybe longer-term issues that we are going to need more information, but at some point should be decided. And we've hit on a lot of topics that have opened a lot of questions today. And now we need to figure out, what the answers are and what direction we should take them. But this group that you've worked with us to assemble here, Daz, I really appreciate the level of expertise. I can't imagine there's a better group of people to be hearing from in the world at this point in time. So thank you to you, and thanks to everyone that participated today.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and I certainly reiterate those sentiments. I think that, again, that starting big and refining down to something small, and this is exactly how it starts. And I really appreciate all of you making the time to help us out and to walk us through this kind of stuff and educate the committee, because it's very helpful. So we really appreciate it. I think we are a little bit over time for our next topic, but we can, unless there's anything else, Mr. Co-Chairman?
Yeah.
Is there any more questions? I don't think so. Again, fellas, thank you. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next topic here.
Thank you.
I think then the agenda is the digital asset lien registry.
Yeah.
Mr. Revelle had some obligations, but I believe is there some folks online in the Zoom world that are waiting to comment? Oh, Brendan is okay. Is there any in addition to Brendan? Is there anybody else?
Do you want to, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Co-Chair?
Since Mr. Avila was involved in the lien cleansing discussion, and I know it's short, maybe we can kick it to tomorrow morning in the interest of time, and then bring Brendan on for a quick discussion on AI and then finish up.
Sure. I think that makes
If
sense.
that works.
Thank
And
you,
then
Mr.
we've got
Co-Chair.
general public comment also, but I don't know if we have any.
Yeah, real quick, Brendan, is there anybody in the room who's interested in commenting on all of that?
Yeah, like
All right, well, Brendan, I know you've probably been chomping at the bit. We want to hear what you have to say, so please go ahead.
Yes, hello, can everyone hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great. Excellent. Good afternoon, Senator Rothfuss, Representative Western. Congratulations on your new co-chair and new committee members and all committee members. Just very briefly, so my name is Brendan Marr. I am an MIT Media Laboratory alumnus from 1998. I'm on the working groups for digital identity, data privacy, and DAOs. And in the context of this, I have a little bit of a relevant background. So I was at the Media Lab in 95 to 98. And at the time, we were all mentored by Marvin Minsky. Marvin Minsky started the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT and was a mentor to us at the Media Lab, as well as Patty Mast, who ran the Software Agents Group. So a lot of what's happening now has a tremendous long history. What's different now is that we have the ability to do this at scale for the masses, folks who are not computer scientists. But what I'd like to do is shed some light on things that might be useful for the committee in terms of a framework of thinking about what's happening now in AI in terms of three areas. Much of what has been said, so I won't elaborate too much, but those three areas would be in terms of data, digital identity and privacy, and control. So regarding data, and I will pause and take questions too, because I know that's really important in this kind of discussions. In terms of data and algorithms, it's extremely important to get a sense, right, that what is happening right now is beyond our ability to comprehend. And what is important to know is that it's not just these large companies and these data models, but AI will be embedded into everything. It's not going to be that we're just going to have these prompts. It's that we're going to have intelligence in our shoes. It's going to be embedded into everything. So if you're not terrified by now, you probably should be. There is a lot to consider. And this is why we have been very careful, I think, for those of us who've been involved in the working groups thus far, very careful in terms of how we've been engineering our current statutes with the digital identity, and the DAO statutes. And I will elaborate more on that, but I want to say one minor thing regarding data and algorithms that's important to understand. It's that we tend to think right now that this is all done by these very large companies and that they have these models and that's the control choke points. And that's actually not true, right? Because what's going to happen is that there will be everybody, including you, Representative Western, will have your own AI, your own ability to embed your own information into AI through embeddings, through information that you insert into these models. So it will be everywhere. And I will take a pause at this time, if it's helpful.
I think we're largely tracking with you so far, so please proceed, Brendan.
Okay, so this idea of a vector database, that you take your own data and then you use that, or a company uses that with their own private data, and they use that to insert into these AIs in order to build their own intelligence is a very important point. And the scale at which this is happening is profound and extraordinary. And what that means, and this is the relevant part and point to the committee, is that, you know, in terms of the models themselves, it would be a very poor idea for legislatures at the state or federal level to think that they, you know, can entirely regulate this. Okay, a large part of this regulation is going to have to be done by companies themselves, in terms of the large models. But you know, on the other hand, in terms of our own, you know, private data, companies' own private data that they insert into these models, you know, there's not going to be control over that, you know, in the same way that you can control an individual company. And that brings us to the part related to identity and privacy. It's also important to know that we have a proposed new revamp of a shot of our statute for digital identity, which I understand is coming up. Daz and I had a chance to speak about that. We think that that's okay, but it you know, I think it's okay in its current form. But it is important to note that the traditional model, you know, that California has with controllers, et cetera, regarding data privacy just simply doesn't work very well with this technology. So we're going to have a very light legislation and it really wait and see now. So it would be, I think, inappropriate, as it's been said in this these discussions earlier, to regulate anything at this time. We really need to wait to see how a little bit more of this plays out. However, the third component, which is in terms of control, is something that Wyoming has an opportunity to play a large role in, right? Because as we've been talking, the constructs that we have with digital identity and agency, our Digital Identity Act is all based around agency law, and how this gets applied to these things becomes really, really important. The ideas of going to control cryptographic signing and not using email as an authoritative source, because that will not work with Web3, right? We need cryptographic signatures for these kinds of things. Becomes very, very important. And you know, as I put forth interim topic on these ideas, and utilizing the unique ability that Wyoming has in its registered agent and Secretary of State interactions to come up with methods for dealing with these kinds of lighthearted control, but in a privacy preserving way. And these things go very much along the lines of what we've talked many, many times before with our discussions with Christopher Allen and certificates and self-signing certificates and all of these kinds of things. So I think you could see at this point that these little pieces that we've been talking about over the years and the legislation we've been putting through over the years has all actually been kind of designed in a way that we'd be able to build up on top of it. We know that. But now is the time for us to think really serious about this, because it is a really serious matter at this. I'll take questions. I hope that's helpful.
Committee, any questions? Brennan or Mr. Co-Chair?
Thank you. And thank you, Brendan, for those thoughts. And, as we look to tomorrow as well, I know you'll be joining us when we look at kind of planning that path forward with digital identity, which is going to be linking into everything that we're discussing and authoritative cryptographic signatures. We'll also have the opportunity to talk with the Secretary of State's office about not only the progress on the digital asset registration, but trying to put together exactly what you're indicating about cryptographic signatures on whether it's for a business or for any other entity. All of those things need to come together, and I think they will, as you know, tie into artificial intelligence governance, particularly with the authentication piece that you're getting at, which becomes critical, right? The impersonation and the authority has to go along with any decision, whether it's made on behalf of a DAO or any other AI decision. So that's all well taken as part of this overall framework that we're trying to get into place. And this is, as you know, since you've been a part of the entire discussion, this is something that we've needed to get online for quite a while, and it's critical to a lot of the other work that we're doing. So thanks for continuing to raise that consideration.
Great. Well, thank you.
Mr. Maher?
Yes.
Oh, no, please go ahead. Just wanted to recognize you.
Oh, well, I will say that these things are extraordinarily important to work through. I know they're difficult. And as I put forth in the interim topic proposal, I think the salient thing to do is to come up with the minimum, 3 or 4 actions that would be required for the Secretary of State to act on and implement, and then defer, all the other heavier lift to registered agents, commercial registered agents. That's really important. Daz and I had a long conversation about this the other night at some ungodly hour, that that it has to be a commercial registered agent, not a regular registered agent. And we'll get into the details of that. But all of these things are very, very important. And, I might add that, there's been a number of different aspects of this discussion around the idea of general artificial intelligence in these matters. And I should say, all the speakers' work is tremendous. They're all spot on. As projected some of his early work in December on using ChatGPT, out a tweet saying that I at the time that I think that we've actually reached general artificial intelligence. Whether I'm wrong by a couple months or a year, does it make a difference? I mean, there is nothing that will not be transformed in unimaginable ways going forward. Because really, this is a transformation of the architecture of the machine. And I'll leave it at that. But it is a profound thing that's about to happen to society.
Thank you, Mr. Maher. Members, any questions for him?
See you tomorrow.
Thank you very much again, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Great.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Co-Chair, yeah, I think we're about that time to adjourn for the day. Again, we'll just punt the lien cleansing forward for tomorrow. Is that
Yeah.
Are we good with that?
Yeah.
Mr. Co-Chair, anything else?
Just see if staff has any questions based on anything today. I don't think we have any actions really at this point, so probably okay. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you all for attending, and we are adjourned until tomorrow morning.
See you all tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.